Lines.
From Washington, D.C., the capital of the divided states of America, it's time for the show that brings you both sides of the issues that matter. In the left corner, I'm political analyst and progressive Democrat Garland Nixon.
And in the right corner, I am Republican investigative reporter Lee Stranahan.
Welcome to the most disruptive show in America, Fault Lines, with Nixon and Stranahan. In the news, President Trump's former presidential campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, and his lobbying associated were indicted on multiple counts as part of the FBI's special investigation yesterday. Hours after the Spanish authorities announced that they would seek to prosecute Catalonia's separatists for rebellion, Carlos Puigdemont, the region's dismissed leader, turned up Monday in Belgium, where he may seek asylum. On Monday, just hours after the announcement of Paul Manafort, Tony Podesta, brother of Secretary Clinton's campaign manager John Podesta, stepped down from his position heading up his lobbying firm. Tony's Podesta Group is one of two firms described in Monday's indictment as having been recruited by Manafort to work in Ukraine.
Although, as they're referred to in the indictment, Company B.
There's Company.
There is no mention of the word Podesta, interestingly enough, in the indictment.
Company B. And Company B, very interesting, was a group that made some really cool songs in the late 90s.
I don't think it's...
I used to like that high energy.
I don't
Maybe
think it's
they
the same
actually
one.
mean the group that made the high energy songs in the late 90s.
Yeah, I think it's a different group.
Kevin Spacey will no longer be honored at the 2017 International Emmys amid allegations that the actor sexually harassed then 14-year-old Anthony Rapp.
In other news, Bo Bergdahl, Army deserter, heads to court again today. He is facing sentencing for his desertion, to which he pled guilty to earlier. Yesterday, he spent a couple hours on the witness stand in distraught testimony after apologizing and then describing what he faced after he was captured by the Taliban for 5 years. In North Carolina, another prison guard has died. This is after something had happened a couple of weeks ago, the attempted prison escape a couple of weeks ago, where buildings were set on fire down there, and one guard who had held on has just died. Again, that's the third guard there. U.S. Special Ops have captured one of the people that they say is behind the 2012 attack in Benghazi. They will be brought to Washington, D.C. for trial. In other fake news, Facebook. As soon as I start with Facebook, it's going to be fake news. Facebook is claiming, in preparing for their testimony, that 126 million people, Garland, 126 million people were affected by Russian propaganda. They said it in that voice, too. That's interesting. Zuckerberg went down to the inner world. That voice, he did that.
And I guarantee, though, that if you look at the exact quote, may have and suspected were somewhere, because there's usually may have and suspected.
I want to know how many people were affected by fill-in-the-blank propaganda. We're CNN, BBC. Let's go with other foreign countries that have news services. BBC
Canada,
propaganda.
Canadian Broadcasting.
NHK, Japan.
That's right.
Has one. Voice of America. Perhaps.
Radio Liberty. We've got lots coming up.
You don't have any...
Oh, man, I've got...
You gotta have something goofy.
Oh, I've got some good news. Wait a minute, this is a good one. A 77-year-old Virginia man has been accused of assaulting a young woman who cops say he met on a dating site. Alan Schmidt was arrested by Newport News cops and charged with allegedly choking the unnamed 23-year-old after she called police Tuesday. Schmidt showed up to meet the woman on Tuesday. She later told police he was much older than he made himself out to be. On the site, plenty of fish.
So I want to go over this. By the way, of course, she shouldn't have been assaulted, and it's horrible. But let's go over some details here. So she's 23.
And he's 77.
He's 77. What did she think he was, like 60?
I don't know, but he's
what can you get away
fish.
With? Because look,
for him, it should have said plenty of fossils.
I'm just going to take me as an example. What could I get away with? You're looking at me, Garland. Garland's looking at me right now.
You can get away with 40s, but not 23.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Mid-40s, 45, 44, 40s, no problem.
And even then, people would be going, man, for 40, you're not looking You're not looking swell. But I couldn't get away with them 31. Could I? Couldn't even get close to that, right?
No, you couldn't get away with that.
Garland's a fantastic looking man.
Nah, I couldn't get away with 23. You look at it and you
23 you'd have trouble with.
23
I'd have trouble believing. Garland could get away with 40s too. I got to say, Jack, my son Jack, look at him. Could you get away, if you met Garland on a dating site? I'm not saying you would, Jack, but if you saw him on a dating site, could you get away if he said 46? You'd buy that? 48?
There we go.
Going 48.
16, so
that's it. I don't sense a love connection here.
No props at all.
But those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Yeah, so one of the things going on today...
Well, wait. Hold up. Wake up, Swampway. You can be part of the show. 202-521. We got to get that in. We got to pimp the number early.
Yeah, I forgot. We've got people that want to be involved, that want to be a part of this.
Yeah, right, exactly.
They're caught in traffic on the Beltway.
Think about this. If you're Paul Manafort, you're stuck at home right now. He's on house arrest. Probably. Paul Manafort, Rick Gates, feel free to call in 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. I got to say, seriously, if you're Paul Manafort, you will get first off, let me go over this. Paul Manafort, listen to me. Attention, Paul Manafort. If Paul Manafort's listening, number one, if you call into Sputnik, it will make headlines. Let's go over that.
Yeah.
It will make headlines. Number two, you will not get a more fair
and balanced.
Because Garland's not a fan of Republicans or probably Paul Manafort's policies. But Garland, what do you think of this indictment? Because I just read the indictment. Let me tell you, I don't like conjecture. So therefore, I'm going to tell you what
give me yours first and I'll give you mine.
Let me tell you where I would be looking.
Okay.
From reading the indictment. And again, Paul Manafort, just feel free to call in anytime, 202-521-1320. Because we know you're out there. He just lives down the road. He lives near me in Alexandria. Not near me. I'm sure it's a better neighborhood than I live in.
Yeah, when you make $75 million, you're probably...
But here's what it is. They go over... I'm going to tell you my suspicion. My suspicion is that what Paul Manafort is being accused of is actually something that happens every single day with rich people. When you read the indictment, he's being accused of buying things through companies. Does that make sense?
Yes.
In other words, what he's being accused of is that he had companies that were in Europe. And that's where the money from the European consulting he did, including Ukraine, went. You with me so far? Then that money was transferred to other companies in the U.S.
Shell companies. He played the Shell game, the Panama Papers.
But by the way, shell companies are legal.
Yeah,
right.
I'm just saying. Here's the reason I said that. Because if you look at the Panama Papers, one of the things that came out in the Panama Papers was that there are a lot of leaders around the world, all of these powerful rich people.
Right.
That's what they do. They open all of these various companies.
Right.
And then they use the companies to buy things around the world. And you can't trace this company owns that company, which owns this company, which owns that company. And you can never trace back to who it is.
But I think there might be other reasons than traceability.
Well, no, I'm saying, but one of the things they do with that is they buy things through the companies so that the company buys it. They don't. They end up buying stuff, not having to pay tax. It's a tax game. It's kind of a tax evasion game.
Right. It's a tax game. And by the way, they don't.
Everywhere.
I mean, whoever pays taxes pays taxes. But in other words, when you get that kind of money, and by the way, I'm not justifying this. I'm telling you what my suspicions are. My suspicions are, and the reason I say my suspicions are this: if you ever go to a trial, and Garland, I'm sure you've been to many, you know what happens. Everyone's had this experience from watching the TV. You watch the prosecutor put on his case, and you go, that seems pretty, boy, the person seems guilty.
Yep.
Then you watch the defense put on their case, and you go, I don't know, the person's probably not guilty. In other words, everybody's had that happen to them where so all we've seen is one side. All we've seen is the indictment.
And then at the end, the prosecutor makes his closing arguments. The defense gets the final closing arguments. And that gives the defense little bit of an advantage.
So
but it's like you said, when you hear each side has a pretty powerful argument.
And I haven't even seen the defense. In other words, I've seen one document, which is the prosecution saying, here's what he did.
Well, there's something.
My suspicion on this is when we look into it, that there's nothing, A, illegal, or B, out of the ordinary. My suspicion right now about what Manafort did. In other words, what I think he did was, for instance, they're saying, this company bought a property. And I think they accuse him, like he was living in it, maybe, or whatever. But whatever. Or they're saying, well, he controlled the bank accounts. I don't know about that. What I mean by that is, I'm sure he had an accountant or whatever. And it's the same way they do with blind trust and stuff like that.
Here's the thing, Lee. I think what you're saying is that here's my thoughts on the two principal things that I'm thinking about. Number one, in that when you're saying a person, and what you said, rich people, not just rich, but people that have, people that are doing pretty good, that you may not consider rich, but you'll consider upper class people, making pretty good money, right?
Manafort was making more than that.
He was making, but a lot of people
do this. So really
that's why I say a lot of people are sweating bullets over this, because a lot of people start nonprofits, they start LLCs, they start corporations, and they buy things. One of the reasons people start an LLC, they'll start an LLC, right? They will loan the LLC money. Right. Then they'll buy, let's say right now you wanted to buy a Mac computer. You loan money out of your pocket to the LLC. The LLC buys the Mac, and then you use your Mac, and then you use it write it off as a business expense, right? And then in another time, guess what? The LLC pays you back because you documented it as a loan. Those things are legal. So what I'm saying is, this game that people play is something that rich people. So there's a lot of rich people sweating bullets because they're like, well, if they're going to go after people from that, we're all toast. That's number one. But number two.
And by the way, some of those rich people are probably named Tony Podesta. But keep going.
Yeah. And so we'll get to that. So, but here's the other part of it that I think is interesting, and we'll see where this goes. So one of the charges had to do with FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act.
Yes.
Right. Okay. And he's being charged criminally with not properly, in a timely fashion, not properly filling out his papers. Right. What's interesting about that is traditionally no one was ever charged for this. Traditionally, what would happen is this. If, let's say, the government finds out, or for whatever reason, you should have filled one out and you didn't. Right. They would traditionally allow. Which
is what Louise Mensch's accusing me of every night on Twitter. By the way, I know she leaves you out of that, but I'm
the invisible man. I don't exist.
Yeah, but it's interesting that she does leave you out of it.
Yes, she has to, because, of course, as we know, I don't fit the premise.
Well, feel free to just shoot her a tweet.
Hi, I'm here.
Hi, I'm here. And
I'm here.
If Lee should file FARA, I probably should too.
Right. But my point being, what they traditionally have allowed people to do is, and I'm not making an excuse for what he did or not. I'm just saying what has happened is they would allow a person to come back later and file it. People were never like, I don't know if anybody's ever been charged for, but if so, it's very, very rare. So one of the things that I've been reading is there is a concern amongst a lot of people who are involved in this that there's going to be a change in policy. And basically now they're going to start going after people who don't fill out the FARA forms on time or adequately, and there are a lot of people afraid because this is actually a change, and I would think that the lawyer would argue to some extent, yeah, maybe it's a violation of the law, but it's an arbitrary.
Yeah, maybe it is. Maybe it's not.
Application of the law. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's.
And by the way, you know why Louise Mensch goes after me?
I'm just saying,
it's racism. That's why she goes after me. She's English, right? Stranahan, Irish.
Oh,
that's what's going on. And now, by the way, speaking of Ireland, let's go to our Irish correspondent
in El Paso.
It's Victor in El Paso, using the Irish phrase "top of the morning." You see, Garland?
Ah, there we go.
Top of the morning.
There you go.
Good morning, my friends.
How you doing, Victor? Have you been indicted this morning yet?
Not quite yet.
Well, if you're going to get indicted, you're going to have to get in line.
So what's what's your take on things, Victor? Hit me.
Well, I was seeing that the U.S. sends 12 Thunderbolt 2 attack planes to Eastern Europe. That's pretty nice. Those are pretty mean-looking Gatling gun jets. They look pretty mean. They look like they can cause a lot of damage. They're going to our NATO members there in Eastern Europe with 300 servicemen. But why do people get killed when they witness a crime? Can you answer that?
Wait, what?
Why do people get killed when they witness a crime? It all depends on the circumstances.
Well, I was watching right there that those folks that keep turning up dead in Las Vegas, you know, the people that got shot at the ground level.
Oh, I don't know. You know what? I don't put anything to that whatsoever. How many people were at that concert? How many people?
Like
20,000 or something.
20,000. Right. So. And
now we have 7 that have given up, you know, some kind of a testimony, and then all of a sudden they run into steel gates and they die. And
yeah, but I got to say that's 19,000 to go. I mean, that's a lot to go. That's what I'm saying. I mean, if the idea is
you got to take out the witnesses, you're going to be busy
right,
taking out 19,000 witnesses.
If somebody's sitting around, Garland, hey, thanks for the call, Victor. If someone's sitting around and saying, hey, here's the thing in Vegas. We need to take out all of these witnesses. They all have to go. Here's how we're going to do it. Car accidents.
Well, here's the question. If you're going to do it, how many actually hitmen does it take per witness? Think about that. You're going to need at least 5 hitmen per witness. We're up to 100,000 hitmen now.
Let me go back to something I was saying yesterday, though. Okay. The Kennedy assassination. It's very interesting in the wake of these files coming out. One of the things you learn is that our government actually had, as wacky as plans sound, like having accidents and all this stuff, your government's done it. The CIA's done it.
You know, it's interesting because
the CIA's admitted to doing it.
And they had plans on like bombs. They had plans on like bombing Miami and doing domestic terrorism.
Yes.
We don't know that they ever did it, but the discussion was there, which is alarming.
So this is what I'm saying, Garland. This goes back 50 plus years now. I was in Dallas for the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. I was down there a little bit. And I saw some speeches and some talks and interviews with people. And I've got to say, as easy as it is to go, well, it's a wacky conspiracy theory to think you would take out all the witnesses. We have cases, actually. This is why I say the Kennedy assassination is so resonant. It has nothing to do with Oswald in particular. It has to do with what the CIA and the FBI have done and what they've covered up, because they have covered stuff up, right?
Yep.
And so, like I say, in the wake of the JFK files being introduced last week, revisiting this, that's what I find interesting, is the fact is it's very hard based on actual history to go, well, the government would never do that. You can't do that. But hey, we'll have more coming up shortly. A lot of great guests today, including, by the way, Dominic Carter coming up later, and a lawyer talking about the Manafort indictments. You're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Fault Lines.
We are back. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan. We've been talking about the Manafort Gates. Let's not forget Rick Gates indictments a little bit, and we will have somebody on in the third hour talking about that. David Simpson. Oops, not David Swanson. Different one. Jonathan Jeffries. There we go. Former federal public defender will be on talking about these indictments coming up later in the show. That's in the third hour, 9 o'clock. I got confused, Garland.
Well, then I'll give you one headline. How about we'll give you 2 headlines?
Well, okay.
The U.S. Coast Guard
trade you.
The U.S. Coast Guard announced Monday that 2 Hawaii women who say they were lost at sea for 5 months never activated their emergency beacon, adding to a growing list of inconsistencies that cast doubt on the women's harrowing tale of survival.
Do you think there's a book deal or something, or
5 months with, and they look really healthy, and they have both their dogs, and they got 5
really?
months. Yeah, and they claimed to be at sea for 5 months.
I'd have to know more.
Yeah, their tales, their stories.
There's sort of more
falling.
fallout. Did we talk about the Kevin Spacey thing? Did you talk about that this morning?
I just mentioned the fact that he's no longer going to be honored at the 2017 International Emmys amid the allegation.
One interesting thing about that was I saw one headline. It's like, well, he's no longer, they've canceled House of Cards.
I think they were going to cancel it anyway.
That's exactly right. Yeah, but it's just the way they get you with headlines.
Well, guess what we have? We have Sister Megan. Oh my gosh, I was going to say Megan. We've got Sister Megan Rice. Is that correct,
Sister Rice? Clear this up for Garland, please.
That's it.
Which one's it?
Megan.
Sister
okay.
Megan Rice. Well, we are
because he gave every possible pronunciation. Sister Rice. He gave.
So I couldn't possibly go wrong.
He covered the spread, as they like to say. How are you this morning?
Megan is fine. Good morning.
We are very happy to have you on. We're very proud. The first time we've had anyone who had the prefix sister before their name, so that's very wonderful. So how are you? You are working. I understand you work on you're a peace activist and you work on anti-nuclear projects.
Well, I hope in combination with the rest of the world.
Not everybody in the world. I got to say, sister, there's definitely some people who are not on that right now. And so, how long have you been working as a peace activist?
Well, there was never really a beginning and an end. It was something that I had to do along with many other people when they really got to know the effects on our whole planet, which weapons of mass destruction like nuclear weapons, which have been developed in this country since 1943 and have only become more and more powerful. So in watching that, I happened to grow up very near to the Manhattan Project, which was what invented and developed it. And so we knew that something very secret was happening 3 blocks away in Manhattan. Then the scientist who lived in our apartment next door couldn't even tell his wife what he was doing. It was so secret. Nor could he tell his daughter. And naturally, he couldn't tell us. But probably 10 years later, 1950-51, my mother realized, put it all together and let me know that Dr. Hecht had reluctantly been involved in that project as a biophysicist. So from then on, various things in my life brought me into touch with radioactivity, and I am aware right now, just maybe over the last 5 years, that if we detonate 2 of the up-to-date warheads that are 1,000 times what was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we would be causing the planet to die by nuclear fallout. And nuclear winter is what they call it, because the sun could not produce food. So the rest of creation, who depends on the sun for food, would be starved gradually over 10 years.
Now, Sister Rice, you're not only the first nun that we've had on the show, but you're definitely the first nun who's done time that we've had on the show.
You.
Yeah.
Yes.
You're welcome. Now you spent, but tell that story, because you spent over a year in federal. Was it prison?
Yes,
it was federal prison, right?
No. There's a little story to that too.
Okay.
There's so many men prisoners now, federal prisoners in men's prisons, that they've begun to take over or retake over prisons that were assigned to women, like Danbury Prison, and so women get put into correctional facilities that are like dormitories and are supposed to hold people while they await trial or waiting to be sent on to a proper prison, if there is such a thing. So we felt our responsibility, three of us, Greg Borgi Obed and Michael Wally and myself, and there were 5 or 6 others also. And we studied and researched and traveled together to visit other peace communities for one whole year. That was in 2011, 2012. And we ended up realizing that these illegal, we must remember that each of the nuclear weapons facilities in this country and around the world are illegal. They're against international laws, treaties that have been validly signed by the United States and as a nuclear power, and many others. There are 8 other nuclear powers, and the rest of the world, in the majority of nations, have signed the various treaties that, first of all, non-proliferation treaties in 1970. So anybody who continued to make nuclear weapons would be against international law and against constitutional law, because the U.S. constitutional law says we are subservient to international laws and treaties. So we realized that we had a huge responsibility, as every person has, when we know that the federal government is doing something that's illegal, and we must oppose and expose that illegality. Do what we can to stop it. We're as responsible as the President of the United States, really, because we're all equally responsible. If it's a democracy, is that not true?
Yes. Well, once again, we're talking with the Sister Megan Rice, who is an anti-nuclear peace activist. Also, I see that you have a master's degree in radiation biology. So let me ask you this. Did you get the master's degree in radiation biology and then become determine you wanted to be a nuclear, anti-nuclear activist, or was it the other way around? Or did, after you determined that you wanted to get
I want to figure out whether you get that before or after you became a nun. That's what I'm actually more curious about. I'm curious about the order there.
Well, I joined our order, the Society of the Holy Child Jesus, back in 1950. So it was just at the time when this information was coming out. However, I was really wanting to go to Africa. Our sisters had schools for girls, for women, teacher training colleges in Nigeria. And I felt the weight of the unfairness with which the African nations, many of the African nations, have been treated, and especially by the United States in its long history of slavery. So I was headed for Africa, for Nigeria. But in those days, the colonial system seemed to be the model of real education to Nigerians. And so I needed a master's degree, simply because they might not recognize my degree from Villanova. At that time, it was not a well-known college. So I got into the biology department at Boston College to get ready to go to Nigeria, and that was about 1958. In 1962, I was sent to Nigeria, and I stayed there until 2003. But all the time, I'd be coming back maybe every 4 years and visit, and I was present at the huge peace walk in Manhattan from the UN up to Central Park, where more than 1 million people, I don't know if you remember hearing about that, were walking. So there was a great energy. I knew people whose fathers had died from swimming around in the Pacific when they were trying to test atom bombs after the war was over in 46, 47, and they were dropping bombs. They had made more by that time on old battleships that were no longer needed by the Navy, just to test them. And I have known and still know people who lost their parents because they were exposed to the radiation in the Pacific by testing the bombs. So it was a huge thing. And when I was teaching in Nigeria, I taught biology, chemistry, and math, and religious education. So it was an opportunity to share the structure of the atom and what was happening to life through radioactivity. And I had actually, at Boston College, I was given a task to use radioactive tritium in testing cell division, which is the cause of cancer, right? So I had this just, should we say, serendipitous background to know the dangers. So I knew if I were to stay in this country, I would have to be exposing and opposing nuclear weapons. And our order has a mission to meet the wants of the age. And they blessed my efforts to study more about the effects about the whole military or nuclear industrial complex, which is still going on today and which is still making in this country highly enriched uranium, which is what we have so complained about in Iran, Iraq, remember Libya, all of that, never mentioning that the United States has 7,500 bombs and continues making highly enriched uranium with your tax money day by day. $10 trillion have been spent on nuclear weapons alone. Russia also has 7,500, but its competition neither is willing to reduce them.
We're talking to Sister Megan Rice. She is a Roman Catholic nun with the Society of the Holy Child Jesus, who has been, and how many times have you been arrested, Sister Rice?
Well, we were arrested many times at the nuclear test site in Nevada, which is the most highly bombed, atomic bombed place in the world. Because I got a chance I was invited to live in a Franciscan community there, which monitors and hosts people coming to the Nevada test site. And that's about 60 miles from Las Vegas. And I was there from 2004 to 2011, doing nothing but kind of, welcoming people. It was hospitality. And then, participating in the protests. And we would purposefully walk across the line. Now, then you'd be arrested. So probably 30, 40, 50 times in those 11 years. And I did spend 6 months in prison in Danbury when I was also caring for my mother for 4 years, because of the School of the Americas in Columbus, Georgia, which teaches torture to Latin American officers. So that's another huge issue that's kept secret, so that the Latin American officers are willing to torture their, who should we call it, people that they're trying to oppress.
Well, I must say, Sister Rice, that we've had anti-nuclear activists on the show before, but the background that you have, having grown up right up the street from the Manhattan Project and having a master's degree in radiation biology, sets you apart from from pretty much all of the anti-nuclear activists that we've had. And
you say the order you're with they've been supportive of you, right? They've continued to be supportive of you.
Any of them who understand the dangers of nuclear weapons, certainly. They see this as one of the important wants of the age, to unmake the bombs and turn all of that industry into life-affirming alternatives. That's why we call ourselves the Transform Now Plowshares.
There we go. Sister Megan Rice, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Love to have you back on sometime.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for calling.
You bet. And where can people, is there a website or something people can go to find out more about the work you're promoting?
Yeah, I suppose Transform Now Plowshares. They look that up.
Okay. There we go. Sister Megan Rice, thanks again, sister, for joining us. Appreciate it.
And thanks for your very good questions.
Thanks.
Thank you. You know, Sister Rice, and from looking, it appears she's, 87 years old?
I think she could be older than that.
She's, it looks like in 2015, she was 85.
Right.
So 87 years old. She sounded very vibrant. You know, I have a lot of respect for a woman. You know, she's dedicated her life to her faith, and she's working on something she believes in. I mean, I think it's beautiful. I think, you know, as I said, the thing I like about this show is kind of we get to do different things. And I think it felt really good just to have her on and to have her be able to talk about what she felt and what she believed in. Very
well, it's a fascinating story, too. As soon as you get a nuclear scientist nun prisoner, just stop right there. That's practically a Showtime series waiting to happen.
Yeah,
I'm just saying, right there.
Yeah, somebody needs to. There needs to be a book about that.
I'm sure there is. Yeah.
Who grew up right up the street from the Manhattan Project?
Yeah, right. Exactly right. Yeah. So no, it's a fascinating story, and it is one of the great things about it. Now we got a lot. We got a lot coming up. Like I say, the other thing I want to make sure we get this in before the break because we got so many great guests today. It is interesting. Let's go back to the Manafort thing. By the way, you can be part of the show, 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. It's interesting that in the Manafort indictment, we barely mentioned the Podesta thing.
Right.
And you mentioned in headlines the Podesta, Tony Podesta, the brother of John Podesta,
who was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager,
has stepped down from the Podesta group. Who is not mentioned. I could not find the word Podesta in the indictment. They call them Company A and Company B.
Right. And
they could have called them Mercury and the Podesta Group.
Right.
Why not do that?
Good question.
It's almost like this is a political setup. I don't know. It's almost like that, Robert Mueller. By the way, Robert Mueller.
He's welcome to call in.
You're welcome to call on the show anytime.
521-1320. The Robert Mueller line is open right now. He can actually come in. We got a chair available for him.
More coming up. You're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. And you can certainly watch us live. You can go to @Stranahan on Twitter, and you can watch the Periscope feed. Don't forget to go to @GarlandNixon and follow me also. Additionally, go to iTunes where you can subscribe, where you can leave a review and a 5-star rating. In the news, one of my, I'm going to go with a headline that I really like. Yahoo News is reporting that, quote, shirtless goofball in flag underwear invades field at World Series. YouTube prankster Vitaly.
I did not.
Yes, that was their exact Yahoo News headline. Shirtless goofball in flag underwear invades field at World Series. YouTube prankster Vitaly Zadarevsky romped onto the field in Stars and Stripes shorts after the Astros' Carlos Correa hit a home run in the 7th inning.
Here's what I'm saying. Some people become nuns, get a master's degree, and then go on to commit acts of civil disobedience and get arrested 40 times or more. And then some people decide to put on a diaper and run onto the field during games. Yeah, you have choices in life. That's all I'm saying.
There's different avenues you can take.
Some people, God has a purpose for us all. That's what I'm saying. And some people choose it differently. We got a lot of clips. Hey, let's get the Turley clip up. Let's get the Engineer Andre, let's get the Jonathan Turley clip up. We got a lot of audio clips about this Podesta. Forgive me.
Yeah.
Well, this mentions Podesta. But we got a lot of clips about the indictment of Paul Manafort and Rick
Gates. And I got some things I want to say about the Podesta stuff anyway, so let's go ahead.
Okay, here we go. Let's play that clip. This is legal analyst Jonathan Turley talking about the goal behind the special counsel.
And I think it sends a signal to others like Flynn, like Tony Podesta, that these are charges that could be brought. I think this indictment is saying that the special counsel is prepared to indict anyone for anything within his mandate. But he's clearly focusing on these types of financial transactions and registration violations.
So do you think this is sending a signal to Tony Podesta?
I think it is, because Tony, so for those of you who don't know, let me give you a little background, because I don't want to, make have an esoteric conversation. So John Podesta was the chairman of Hillary Clinton's campaign. He has a brother named Tony Podesta. Some years ago, the two of them started a lobbying firm called the Podesta Group.
Where did they get that name?
I don't know.
Okay.
It's weird. But Tony Podesta now runs the firm. All right. So 2006 through 2015, Paul Manafort was working in Ukraine, working for the Ukrainian government, doing various lobbying type things, PR things, things of that nature, right? At some point during that period of time, he enlisted the aid of Tony Podesta and the Podesta Group, and they were paid, from what we know, $1 million, at least $1 million or more, a lot of money. We know of $1 million. So as soon as Paul Manafort as the investigation focused on Paul Manafort's activities in Ukraine, needless to say, the Podesta Group's activities immediately fell under that umbrella of suspicion or concern. So Paul Manafort was charged yesterday with a number of crimes related to his activities in Ukraine. Within hours after Paul Manafort was indicted, Tony Podesta, who is now the head of the Podesta Group, stepped down, called all of his managers in and said, basically, I'm stepping down, something to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing, I have to fight this fight on my own. Now, here's my immediate thought, Lee, and that is, to some extent, I think this is some blowback happening because, the Clinton people, it's been widely, arguments have been made that the Russiagate assertions started with John Podesta, started with Neritin and the Centers for American Progress.
It started
people.
With the Ukrainians, but
right. But I'm saying that there was a determination made to use that
clearly
in the election to go after Trump,
yes.
Right? A while back. In fact, they used the word they were going to use it to slaughter Trump based on his bromance with Putin. That's what they said. But at any rate, so here's the thing. I don't suspect when John Podesta started this thing.
There was, let's just be clear, there was no bromance.
No,
you know what I'm saying? But I agree. I know. But I'm just saying.
That had to do with what that had to do was when Hillary determined that her greatest vulnerability had to do with the Uranium One deal, and they decided to. But that's a whole other story. But at any rate, all that comes together. But ultimately, I don't suspect when Podesta and Podesta et al. Determined that they were going to go after Trump regarding about the Russia connections, that they ever thought that it would come all the way back home and that there'd be this kind of blowback.
Oh, I disagree. By the way, I think one of the things that's held them from pushing this as much as they'd like to is they were aware that the Podesta Group is tied up in this. I really believe that. I think because you got to ask yourself, you notice after the election, they started hitting on the Trump-Russia thing even more. They doubled down. They tripled down on it. Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
One of the reasons they did that, one of the things that held them back is they knew that the Podesta Group, and by the way, this doesn't even that doesn't make any sense. This whole thing needs to be untangled a little bit here. Who were Podesta, the Podesta Group? By the way, I'm not a fan of anyone named Podesta. You may be a nice person, but just not a fan. I'm not a fan of John Podesta at all. My mentor, Andrew Breitbart, hated John Podesta.
Here's the thing. I'm a progressive. I was a Bernie supporter. Trust me. I ain't a fan of Podestas either. There have been no friends to progressives.
That being said, I don't think the Podesta Group did anything wrong lobbying for the Party of Regions, nor do I think Paul Manafort did. I'm going to say that again. I don't think they did anything wrong. I think the system of lobbying, I don't like the system of lobbying that we have, of which, by the way, there's a tremendous amount that goes on both sides. In other words, Here's what's happened. There's a pro-Ukrainian nationalist lobbying movement, and there's an anti-Ukrainian nationalist lobbying movement, right? Does that make sense?
Yep.
Because what happened was...
And they see them as the pro-Russian, the way they view them is the pro-Russian and the pro-EU,
right,
Western
which they kind of are,
yeah.
Except it gets confusing because Manafort was urging the Party of Regions to back off from Russia. So this is really important to understand. Manafort told them, and by the way, do I think that was good advice? I think that was probably good advice. In other words, look at the situation from Manafort's view. It's the lead up to the Euromaidan revolution. It's 2013. And there's pressure to join the EU in some way to get with the EU. Manafort's advice seems to have been, yeah, Yanukovych, you might want to back off from your relationship with Putin a little bit. Does that make sense?
Well, how about this?
I think
maybe if he'd listened to him, he wouldn't have there wouldn't have been a coup, and he wouldn't have got overthrown.
There definitely wouldn't have been a coup if they'd gone along with the EU. But the reason they didn't do it is because the cost of going with the EU. It's not like he had two equal offers on the table.
Yep.
The cost of going with the EU, and again, this is the kind of nuance that the media will never tell you. In a million
they won't even discuss
years.
Ukraine. There's not even such a country. There's not even a country that called Ukraine. There was no coup in 2018.
That's right.
There's nothing.
2013.
2013.
2014.
2014.
Really. 2014.
But there was no coup in 2014. Nothing existed.
The Euromaidan technically started in November, but things had been leading up to it. But the EU, and by the way, they won't talk about all the Soros funding that was pushing this. And by the way, Soros is a big funder of the Atlantic Council.
And for those of you
it's all pro-NATO.
Right.
This is all pro-NATO stuff. That's what's going. By the way, that's what's part of what's going on.
Well, you know what it is? It's interestingly enough, it's kind of refiring up the Cold War, and it's the newest version of the Cold War's proxy war, and Ukraine is ground zero of it. If you want to know about Ukraine, there's a movie you can go online, and it's called Ukraine on Fire.
Have you seen it yet?
Still haven't seen it.
You still got to Garland.
I haven't seen it, but I know everybody else should see Ukraine on Fire.
You've got to watch the movie. I'm telling you. Sit down and watch like 15 minutes, and then watch another 15 minutes. Bring it fishing with you. Do something, but no, seriously, watch the film because it will freak you out. You'll be like, "Oh, I get it. It all makes sense now." Oliver Stone produced it. Very well made film. But here's my point. I'm in favor of realism. This is one of the things I've liked when we've talked to people, Mindy, our boss here on Sputnik, when I've talked to him about the situation, he's never been like rhapsodizing. He's like, oh, Yanukovych, he was awesome. He's never been that. What he's pointed out is, because am I saying Poroshenko is worse than Yanukovych? I'm not even saying that. I'm saying Ukraine's a very corrupt country who flips alliances as it suits them. This is the history of the country.
Right. And my point,
they flip alliances as it suits them.
And my point being that what people need to understand about Ukraine, if you understand anything about Ukraine, is that you've got the West, the EU and the US on one side, and you've got the Russia on the other side, and you've got this kind of proxy war going on. As to who's going to be in charge of Ukraine, whether it's going to be a person that leans towards Russia or leans towards the U.S., the EU alliance, and rather than allow the Ukrainians to determine the direction of their politics, basically there was a coup that was facilitated in 2014 that determined we're going to put a guy in here who's pro-EU, and that's what's been going on ever since.
I just like to be realistic. I like to be realistic about this.
Well, let me add this. And it's not that I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm just a person. I'm just saying that's what it is. It is what it is. You can determine it. You can evaluate it any way you want to, good, bad, or indifferent. That's just a factual statement.
But what happens is the media in this country, and here's the thing, I'm fine with, because, you know, I've been talking about like I'll bring up the JFK thing briefly. I've been looking into that, and I talked about the long history, right? Do you know who else was doing bad stuff? I've talked about the CIA, the KGB.
Yeah, absolutely.
The KGB, the Soviets were doing lots of bad stuff. Do you know who else was doing bad stuff? Castro. Castro did lots of bad stuff.
The Mossad. I mean, go on and on. That's what
right.
So, intelligence agencies do, stuff that
Right.
you probably wouldn't want to
so
know about.
My whole point
out.
is just I like to be realistic about it, even when people bring up. Here's what I don't like about people bringing up the U.S. and slavery, for instance. I'm fine with bringing up slavery, but bring up the fact, because this is a fact, that most slaves from the African slave trade didn't go to the U.S. They went to South America. Brazil got the most slaves, actually. Now, I don't hear people talk about that. So if you want to put in context and go, lots of countries were part of the Atlantic slave trade, that's fine. This is my whole point on a lot of this stuff, is just bring up stuff in parallel. But now, on these Manafort indictments, this to me, right now, this feels political. Let's play that clip. This is Christian Adams. I like Christian Adams. Andrew Breitbart introduced the two of us. Let's play Christian Adams talking about how he views, and again, Christian's a conservative. So let's be clear. Let's play Christian Adams talking about this indictment.
What do you make of these charges? What do they say to you?
It's a pretty weak debut. You know, you were expecting more. Don't forget, Martha, why Attorney General Jeff Sessions recused himself. It's because of something involving Russian collusion. But when you read the indictment, it's striking how these are charges from things that happened a long time ago, have nothing to do with Russia. Yet take a look at how the attorneys who drafted it struggled to inject Russia into the story.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I got to say this, too. The other thing that bugs me about this, but I agree, and again, I agree with everything Christian said, is that a lot of people, I said this on Friday when the indictments were announced. I said it's on Twitter, it's up there, it's public. I said, I'm not going to have any conjecture on what the charges are, but I think a lot of people are going to be disappointed. And sure enough, people jumped into my timeline, and a couple people were like, well, yeah, Manafort's about to go down for treason, or Trump's about to go. I'm like, no one's going down for treason. And then some people were like, well, I can't wait. It's going to be Hillary. I'm like, are you high? What? No, it's not going to be Hillary.
What's the discussion we've been had? These were charges, and as I said, it is what it is. You know, there are people that got upset on me. So I'm on the left. There are people that had got angry at me yesterday and said I did a Facebook video yesterday because once someone actually said to me, and I said, look, these are administrative charges. They are not in any way related to Russia. It's a different country, and they're administrative charges. You go up and down K Street, you can get a whole lot of people and start looking into lobbyists that work overseas. Right. Whole lot of people that go down for the same thing,
or domestically, or lobbyists to work domestically. Doesn't make any difference.
Non-lobbyists. You start going into rich people, and you're going to find all kinds of shell companies and games like that. But the bottom line was, and someone said, "Oh, come on, Garland, why don't you just enjoy it?" And I had to do a Facebook video, and I said, wait a minute. I said, hold on a minute. What am I to enjoy about this? And that's when I said, of course, you know, I went on about policy. What is in it for me policy-wise?
Well,
what is in it for the working class? What is in it? What is it? Is this some kind of a symbolic victory? So I'll speak for progressives. Is this some kind of symbolic victory that progressives or people on the left are supposed to have? I can't get anything. I've got a party that has pretty much purged people like me, progressives, right out of the party, getting nothing from the Democratic Party right now. One week, progressives are looking at the Democratic Party saying, wait a minute, they just purged us all out of the party. They've, you know, turned their back on us. We're a hated species. And the next week, I'm supposed to enjoy a symbolic victory that the resistance and that the same people who robbed Bernie, the same people who've taken the party to a Wall Street I'm ready here. Let me finish my rant.
Let's get the Dershowitz clip ready. Engineer Andre, let's get the Dershowitz clip ready. Because I just want you to hear this. This is the thing I talked about yesterday.
Yeah, go ahead.
This has to do, to me, this Dershowitz clip, this came out last week. It's before anything about the indictments. But just take a listen to this. This is Alan Dershowitz, the Democrat Harvard law professor, talking about how nuts things have gotten, how partisan things have gotten.
I think the Republicans and the Democrats are playing the same dangerous game. If they don't like something the other side did, they say, crime, lock her up, lock him up, impeach. That's not the way this works. There is no crime to create a dossier unless somebody said to somebody else, do something criminal, hack the Democratic National Committee, do something illegal. But just gathering negative information, it's not a crime. It's as old as Thomas Jefferson.
Right. In other words, this is and this has to do with the Republicans throwing back, oh, look, the Democrats paid for the dossier. Then it turns out the Free Beacon, who's funded by your buddy Paul Singer there, he's a big Republican who, by the way, Steve Bannon's announced he's going after. And remember, Singer's been a guy you brought up on the right.
Yeah.
So,
but I mean, to me,
this is the equivalent of, I would say, Hillary Clinton saying she's going after Soros. Does that make sense? In other words,
yeah.
Well, not that Singer's ever paid Bannon. That would be the equivalent of Bannon going after the Mercers, I guess.
But that's the type of billionaire that he is, a guy who goes around the world, destroys countries, and tries to change the laws.
But Steve Bannon, see, you keep saying you don't agree. I think if Steve, and by the way, Steve, feel free to come in any morning. But Steve won't even come in the mornings at Breitbart show on Sirius. So I don't think he's going to come in here. But I guarantee you, if you sat down, if Steve Bannon sat down here, you'd be surprised at how much you agree with Bannon on stuff. Not on everything, obviously, but I think you'd agree with him about as much as you agree with me, which is probably more than most people would suspect when you hear, oh, it's a show with a Trump supporter and a Bernie supporter. By the way, tell your friends, tell your neighbors about the show, and feel free to call in 202-521-1320.
I'm guessing the only reason that Steve Bannon is going after Paul Singer is because he listened to this show. He heard my rants about Paul Singer, and he goes, I've been enlightened. Garland Nixon has enlightened me about the evils of Paul Singer. He's got to go down.
Yeah, I don't think Bannon.
Guess.
I'm sure Bannon. I'm sure you're not quite as big an influence on Steve Bannon as you think.
Oh,
but maybe. No, but seriously, I mean, this is the thing, and this is the point that Dershowitz is making, and I agree with it. Calm down on the partisanship, because this is what I don't like about people who are hyper-partisan. You know what? If you're one of the people benefiting from the system, I get it. But if you're just a person who's out there, who's a spectator, stop helping these billionaires by doing their bidding and carrying water for these people. Stop carrying water. I say that to people on the right and the left.
It's symbolic victories.
Yeah, and by the way, the big loser is you. I got to say this. It's not you, Garland. It's the American people.
Me too.
Hey, we have more coming up. You're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Fault Lines.
From Washington, D.C., the capital of the divided states of America, it's the show that brings you all sides of the issues that matter. In the right corner, I am Republican investigative reporter Lee Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I'm political analyst and progressive Democrat Garland Nixon.
You're listening to the most disruptive radio show in America. It's Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan. Hour 2 of Fault Lines coming up this segment. Joining us from Barcelona to talk about the Catalonia situation will be Jake Wallace-Simons. Let's get to the headlines. The big headline, of course, is that Paul Manafort and Rick Gates were indicted yesterday. They are currently under house arrest after pleading not guilty in their indictments on charges of money laundering and what they say is conspiracy. Also, they got a guilty plea from a Trump advisor named Papadopoulos. I'm just going to go with that.
They got a guilty plea. He's of Greek descent.
Yes, over lying to federal officials over a contact he had. Again, these are all minor charges. If people were expecting the big treason frog march, they did not get it here. John Kelly, the chief of staff of the White House, said that these allegations happened long before Manafort or Gates ever met Donald Trump, which seems to be accurate. In North Carolina, Bo Bergdahl, the Army deserter, sentencing continues for Bergdahl. He testified for about 2 minutes yesterday, 2 hours yesterday, and was described as very distraught after apologizing and then describing what he faced, the torture he faced in the 5 years he was with the Taliban after deserting his post. The president of the College of Charleston has apologized after Pictures emerged of students apparently wearing what they say are racist costumes, including one student in an orange jumpsuit with a sign that said Freddie Gray on it. Freddie Gray, of course, died in police custody in Baltimore, sparking the Baltimore riots a couple of years ago. Facebook says that 126 million Americans, faced what they say is Russian propaganda. We've talked about that. We'll talk about that more. That's the headline, but there's a lot more details. They're doing this as Facebook is prepared to speak in front of Congress.
The Producers Guild of America has enacted a lifetime membership ban against movie mogul Harvey Weinstein. Police in Japan have arrested a 27-year-old man after he admitted to killing an unidentified person and dismembering the body. Japanese media reports parts of as many as 9 bodies were found in the apartment of Takehiro Shirashi in southwest Tokyo. On Monday, just hours after the announcement of the indictment of Paul Manafort, Tony Podesta, brother of Secretary Clinton's campaign manager John Podesta, stepped down from his position heading up his lobbying firm. Tony's Podesta Group is one of 2 firms described in Monday's indictment as having been recruited by Manafort to work in Ukraine.
And finally, NPR is reporting this morning that there is a computer that is able to predict when people are suicidal with a 91% accuracy rate in tests that were done. Basically, Garland, they analyzed the way people respond to certain words like death. And then the computer is able to predict who's suicidal and also is a high percentage of predicting who's attempted suicide. So your iPhone could soon be, making calls to the authorities for you if they get worried.
There we go.
I'm sure the CIA would like that. That's headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan. Hey, I want to get right to our guest. We have Associate Global Editor at thedailymail.com, Jake Wallace-Simons, joining us. You're in Barcelona, right, Jake?
That's right. Yeah, I'm in Barcelona right now. That's right. I've been here since Friday, just when the Catalan Parliament declared independence from Spain, and that was when the real action started. So I've been here from the beginning.
Okay, so let me ask you this, because we always like to get people like yourself who are actually on the ground, and it's this wacky thing Garland and I like to do, which is get facts. It's crazy. But what's it like? I'm very curious about what the mood is. This is something that you read a lot of reporting, but you're out there on the street, and I assume getting dinner late at night because they do that in Spain, right? So, but what's it like? What's it actually like in Barcelona right now?
Well, I think in Barcelona, it's fair to say that emotions are running very, very high indeed. It's been like a yo-yo for weeks now, ever since the referendum that they held here in Catalonia as to whether they wanted to split from Spain or stay part of Spain. And the Declaration of Independence finally came on Friday, and immediately there was this mood in Barcelona of absolute euphoria and jubilation. I went into the main square there, and there were 17,000 people packed into this square, partying like it was almost going to be the end of the world. Really going for it. Loud music, rock music, dancing, huge amounts of flags, drinking, really, really celebrating. And that was the immediate reaction. But then after that, things took a different turn because less than half of Catalans voted in the referendum. The referendum was very strange because anybody who didn't agree with Catalonia separating from Spain just didn't vote because they thought the referendum was illegal. So the only people who voted were the ones who believed in independence. So they were the guys celebrating. But the next day, there's another half of the Catalan population who still want to be part of Spain. They tend to be a bit less sort of out there, a bit less energetic, a bit less in your face. But then on the Sunday, there was a vast demonstration with up to 1 million people here in Catalonia, of people coming out saying, we do not want independence. We don't want it to happen. So tempers were really rising high at that point. And that was when violence began to be seen on the streets. There were some hardline Spanish nationalists fighting with Catalan police on the streets. There were some Spanish fascists giving Nazi salutes. There were some Spanish fascists shouting "Viva Franco." Franco was basically, Spain's Hitler, I guess, and some people still believe that he was the right guy for the job. And so there were some very ugly scenes there, and that's really continued. Last night, I went to this big demonstration where an anti-fascist, ultra-leftist group of about 1,000 people dressed in black with black masks were parading through the streets trying to confront this fascist group. So it's been really kind of tense here. And the political...
How big was the fascist group, by the way? How big was the group?
I would say they were about the same sort of size. I mean, the strange thing was that both of the groups were so kind of far off their end of the spectrum that they both wore the same color. They both wore black. But the guys, some of them had shaven heads and beer guts. They were the fascists on the one side. The others were kind of lanky, younger people with black masks and black flags. They were the ultra left, and in the middle was a whole load of riot cops. So it was pretty tense, and they didn't like journalists taking pictures. I had water thrown over me. There was a lot of aggression on the street. But I think that the main point really is that yesterday the political events were absolutely extraordinary. Honestly, they were the strangest political day I have seen in many, many years. Because what happened was the president of Catalonia, who was kicked out by Madrid when he declared independence, Carles Puigdemont, his name is, he said, "I'm coming to work on Monday. Even though Spain has said I'm sacked, I'm still coming to work. I don't care if they arrest me. I don't care what they do. I'm coming to work as normal. I'm still the president. All other Catalans, I want you also to join me in peacefully resisting Madrid," right? So he was coming out with all this stuff over the weekend. Came to Monday morning, he didn't show up. And all the people were waiting for him to, be the big brave guy. He didn't show up. Nobody knew what was going on. Then came an announcement that the Catalan parliament was going to accept Madrid, shutting it down. And then we heard, get this, that the ousted Catalan leader had run away to Belgium.
Interesting.
Without telling anybody. So, I mean, not only had he run away to Belgium, but that morning he went to Instagram and he posted a picture of his office. Now, he was obviously trying to give the impression that he'd gone to work, but journalists noticed that the color of the sky didn't match the sky that we were seeing above our heads. So it was taken at another time. And we began to get a bit suspicious, thinking, this doesn't look quite right. We haven't seen him come in. He's tweeted this picture. It doesn't look right. And then the news breaks that he's gone to Brussels. He's run away. And so right now, actually, as I speak, he's giving a press conference in Brussels, in Belgium, explaining himself to all the people that he hoodwinked, and telling them why he did it. So that's happening as I speak, and I'll give you some updates as they come in.
So if I've got this correctly, see if I understand this correctly, it sounds to me like what you're saying is that ultimately the people who want to split from Spain versus the Catalans who want to split from Spain versus those who want to stay are kind of about even or somewhere close to even, and that in all of the turmoil, the more extremist groups, the fascist and then the anti-fascist, in all the turmoil kind of stepped in to kind of air their grievances and fights or whatever against each other amidst the turmoil. And it almost sounds like ultimately like the independence movement is kind of fallen apart or is falling apart as their leader has run off to another country. Is that a fair evaluation of kind of the way you just explained it?
That's absolutely right. I mean, that's a very good summary. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that traditionally over the years, opinion polls have never shown that more than 45% of Catalans have supported independence. And when this, but consistently over the years as well, the Spanish government has refused to allow Catalonia to have a referendum to resolve the issue. Because from Madrid's point of view, from Spain's point of view, they have, Catalonia is not the only part of the country that thinks about independence. There's also the Basque country. They want independence too. If they give a referendum to Catalonia, other parts will want a referendum too, and they might end up with their country falling apart, right? I mean, in Britain, we had the Brexit referendum. Nobody expected Britain to vote to leave Europe, but we did anyway. So Madrid's been too nervous to give a proper referendum to Catalonia, even though only 45% of people actually have said they want to leave Spain. So that has led to this sense amongst pro-independence people in Catalonia that they're not being respected, they're not being listened to, they're not even being given the opportunity to vote, to show their will, demonstrate what they want. And that came to a head in the beginning of October when the Catalan government, eventually, which is controlled by pro-independence parties, said, you know what, we're just going to do a referendum anyway. We don't care. We don't need permission from Spain. We're going to do it. We're going to do it our own way. From Spain's point of view, this was illegal. And then you had those scenes where Spain sent in these riot police who beat up people in a very, very brutal way. You might remember they were, scenes of them hitting grandmothers, dragging young women by the face across the street, and being very, very brutal indeed in trying to stop this referendum from happening. And that raised the whole tension and tempers in Catalonia. And then that led to this Declaration of Independence, which, as I said, only represents the people who voted. And the people who voted are the guys who said this is a legal referendum because the Catalan president has said it's legal, and they are the pro-independence supporters. So it's a very complicated picture, but your summary is absolutely correct. The extremists have jumped on this as an opportunity to cause some trouble and have a bit of a fight in the street. Everyone is getting very, very heated, and right now, like we said, the president's run away, leaving his supporters in the lurch, and nobody knows what is going on. So he's explaining himself as we speak in Brussels.
Now, is there any sense that there is outside agitation going on? In other words, is there outside funding? Are governments or civil society groups that aren't from Spain or aren't Catalonian playing a factor in this at all that you can tell?
I wouldn't say that is the case. In fact, one of the complaints that has been aired in recent days is that the European Union has not got involved enough to try to diffuse the tension between the two sides. In fact, the European Union and all the biggest member states all said that they support Spain, that they won't recognize Catalonia, an independent, free Catalonia. They've taken sides. They haven't really got involved very much. But I think one thing that we have noticed is that every time there's been a big pro-Spanish demonstration in Barcelona, and I myself have gone to two of them, and at each one we had more than 1 million people on the street. So this is big, we're talking big demonstrations. Each time the pro-independence Catalans have said that, hey, most of these 1 million people have been bussed in from Madrid. They're not actually Catalan. They're unionists, they're nationalists that have been bussed in all the way from the Spanish capital to try and make us look like we're weak. And certainly in the first demonstration, I saw a lot of buses coming in with protesters. But in the demonstration on Sunday, I met a lot of people who were pro-Spanish but were Catalan as well. But there is an anxiety that outside elements from elsewhere in Spain are influencing affairs here. But there isn't really a sense that any outside powers, in terms of powers from abroad or any other more sinister kind of party is involved in fomenting any of this unrest.
So how are the newspapers? How's the main newspapers in Barcelona? What are the headlines? What kind of positions are they taking on this?
Well, I mean, Catalan and Spanish media, particularly the TV, actually, is notoriously biased. So it's very difficult to find, particularly a TV channel. I'll come to the papers in a second, but particularly a TV channel that is neutral. So you get the Catalan media focusing on the police brutality from the Spanish police when they tried to crack down on the referendum. And there have been some suggestion that some of the footage and the pictures have been doctored or exaggerated, that maybe some of the things were a little bit faked. But I mean, the brutality did happen, but there's been some fuzziness around the edges. By contrast, the Spanish media have really ignored the police brutality to begin with, didn't really cover it very much, and then covered it in a way that the cops are doing their job. So there's this complete divergent narrative on what's going on in Catalonia, and this has been reflected on the streets. One of the two main chants that pro-Spanish demonstrators have been shouting in the streets recently is, one, the president should be sent to prison. That's the first thing. And the second one is that the Catalan media is fake. And in fact, during the Unionist demonstration, just after the Declaration of Independence, a crowd of pro-Spanish thugs attacked one of the radio stations, one of the Catalan radio stations, smashing windows and forcing journalists to barricade themselves inside until the police could disperse the crowd outside. So your question about the media is a really relevant one because it's so polarized and it really gets to the heart of the row that's taking place here. And as for the papers, yeah, I mean, you have a similar split, not quite as polarized as the TV stations, but certainly you do have, the Spanish media, Spanish papers tend to have big pictures of the Spanish Prime Minister, Mr. Rajoy, on the front in a kind of heroic sort of a pose, and you have the diametric opposite on the front of many Catalan papers with the ousted heroic, David against the Goliath of the Spanish state, Mr. Puigdemont, the former Catalan president, depicted in quite a heroic way as well. So,
it's an amazing story. We're joined by Jake Wallace Simons, joining us, the associate global editor at dailymail.com. You can check out his work at dailymail.com. Thanks again for joining us. Just an amazing portrait of what's going on. Stay safe there in Barcelona. We would hate to see you barricaded anywhere. So stay safe. We got more coming up. Next segment, we got Dominic Carter, the great Dominic Carter, barricaded in New Jersey right now outside the Bob Menendez trial. He's not barricaded. You're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on 105.5 FM on every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. In the news, New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said on Tuesday a ban on foreigners buying existing homes would begin in early 2018, but the restrictions will not apply to Australians. The FBI has opened a preliminary inquiry into Whitefish Energy's $300 million contract to rebuild Puerto Rico's power grid after Hurricane Maria, sources said. And the White House Chief of Staff John Kelly on Monday said Robert E. Lee was an honorable man and said that the lack of an ability to compromise led to the Civil War, thrusting himself into the public spotlight on an emotionally charged issue.
Also known as U.S. history.
We have with us Dominic Carter. Dominic Carter is a reporter with Verizon Fios News, and he's been reporting for some time now on the Bob Menendez trial in New Jersey. How's it going there, Dominic?
Good morning, guys. How are you?
Fantastic. What's the latest information?
Yeah, I understand the defense rested, correct? Is that what's going on? By the way, Dominic, we appreciate Dominic coming in because this is a story that the mainstream media is completely undercovered. So, Dominic, the defense is rested, correct?
Well, the defense has rested, and I want to focus on, I was listening to your last guest from Spain, Barcelona, I believe.
Yes.
He said, quoting him, that you asked a relevant question. And again, the reason why I enjoy being on this program, it's important for the viewers and the listeners to understand that you guys know what you're talking about. And I say that based on 30 years in journalism. Okay, so what's the case in point, Dominic, for why you said at this point, this time? The last couple of times you guys had me on, you asked about the appeal process and who was setting up for the appeal. Is that being set up right now? So you asked what happened yesterday. What happened yesterday was all about the appeal, all about the appeal. Judge Walls was not a happy camper as defense counsel for Dr. Melgen, Dr. Solomon Melgen, the wealthy eye doctor who's the co-defendant to Senator Menendez. It's alleged that Dr. Melgen funneled gifts and trips and private jet rides in return for Menendez advocating for his business interests. And so the defense threw down the gauntlet, if you will, and said, we want a mistrial. That was nothing more than just posturing for the appeal process. So they were setting up yesterday. That's what happened all day yesterday for the most part. In the event that Menendez is convicted, and I'm not so sure he's going to be convicted, there's a possibility he might walk. It's a tough climate for politicians facing corruption charges, but he might walk, and there might be a hung jury. Those are real possibilities. I don't know what's going to happen as of right now, but it tied directly back to what you guys said in terms of setting up the appeal, and that's what the defense was doing all day yesterday. Judge Walz didn't take too well to it. He called the defense argument silly. They claimed that they couldn't introduce evidence that they wanted to introduce, that the judge limited them, and he said no. So this morning, to fast forward, the cameras, we've been talking about the media guys. The cameras are here now because we're getting to the conclusion. And as I look directly in front of the courthouse, I can see about 8 television cameras set up. The senator arrives shortly around 9 o'clock, and so they're waiting for him now. More cameras are already en route. So that's what's going on as of now, and the judge is going to receive the lawyers are going to debate the instructions that the judge is going to deliver to the jury, which is tomorrow.
Now, one of the things that's interesting here is if Menendez, let's say Menendez is convicted, let's say he's thrown out of office, Chris Christie, the Republican governor, would be picking his replacement. Has Christie chimed in at all so far on this trial as it's been going on? Or because he's got that responsibility, has Governor Chris Christie been staying out of it?
Christie has been staying out of it so far, but it's not a given that Menendez is going to be thrown out of office. See, that's the key. And then the question becomes, when would he be thrown out of office? So let's just say, for argument's sake, one, the trial was extended. So the judge set a timetable of up to Thanksgiving. So let's just say, for argument's sake, that it takes the jury that long. God knows I hope that's not the case, as somebody that's covering this every day. Let's say it takes up until Thanksgiving. Christie is gone in early January. So Menendez would hold on for the Democrats, given that polling shows that another Democrat is coming into the governor's mansion. So it's a matter of timing. Under your assumption, if he is convicted, you can bank on it that Menendez is going to hang on until the Democrat takes office in early January.
That's very interesting.
Because the Democrat would appoint another Democrat. If Menendez stepped down, remember just last week, the Democrats needed him on a consumer protection bill to vote in Washington. Ultimately, the Republicans won because the vice president cast the tie-break
right.
vote. So he took the train down, and then flew down and took the train back. So he's still in line with the Democrats, that is Menendez. And I doubt that Christie is going to have the option of appointing his replacement at all.
Right, because even if he's convicted, he can certainly not step down and make the argument that he's going to wait until the appeal process is over, which could be 60 days to whoever knows how long an appeal process could end up if it would go to the Supreme Court. Which, of course, as we've discussed, he has a very, very good possibility if he doesn't skate at the judge at the level that he is now, there's a significant possibility that he'll walk. So I think now it certainly appears like what you're saying is, short of winning the governorship in New Jersey, which the numbers don't look strong for the Republicans, they're not going to get a chance to replace Bob Menendez with another Republican.
Basically, what I'm saying is I agree with you 1,000%. That's a wrap. If the Republicans were banking on Chris Christie, close friend of President Trump, having the opportunity in this blue state to sneak in a Republican in the senior senator's seat, that's not going to happen. With the timing of this trial, as long as this trial is run, they're not going to have that opportunity. If this had been wrapped up much sooner, then it was possible. But you better believe the Democrats are telling Menendez behind closed doors, no matter what you do, you must outlast Chris Christie.
Now, with the indictment yesterday of Paul Manafort and one of his close associates, so the issue of lobbying has come up. I would say, to me, if I were looking at this objectively, a U.S. senator currently being on trial for influence peddling, which is what's going on here, right? I mean, that's what this is about at essence, right? Was that the accusation broadly is that Menendez got stuff and then did stuff because he got stuff. Is that correct? I mean, that's just dumbing it down.
Absolutely.
Right. So it would seem to me like this would be major, major news. And if we want to have a discussion about lobbying in this country, which I think we should have, I think the Manafort thing falls in that. In other words, why is someone making millions of dollars for lobbying? What's the system set up? But I don't see anybody at a national media level, and I think we all know why, wanting to discuss lobbying in general, right? The Manafort thing is pretty clearly a political hit on Donald Trump. That's what it is. By the way, I got to say this. If Manafort, Garland, do you agree with me? If Manafort had never worked for the Trump campaign, he would not be indicted right now. Do you agree with me?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
And,
that's my opinion, yeah.
Yeah, and in this case, and by the way, if Menendez had been associated with the Trump campaign, if he'd been a Republican, I think the media would be all over the Menendez trial right now. Do you agree with me there?
I don't know.
Really?
I don't know because, see, now,
really?
Dominic, here's where I see it, Dominic. Here's what I see.
Dominic, what do you think?
Here's what I see as the issue, and tell me what you think about this. I think that the principal issue here that crosses party lines, that's bipartisan, is, and this is the overarching issue, is the fact that we're moving into an era where politicians there's almost nothing they can do that would constitute corruption
I
in the
agree
court.
there. I agree
and then
with you
I think both sides of the aisle, Lindsey Graham showed up. I think both sides of the aisle look in the mirror and say, "There but go the grace of there but by the grace of God go I." And I think it's a bipartisan thing right now, though they won't come out and say it. I think both sides of the aisle, unfortunately, a lot of politicians are happy, smiling, saying and rubbing their hands together, saying, "Oh boy, they can't even come after me anymore. It's open season. If you're a politician, you can get anything you want. You can do anything you want, and they can't touch you anymore." What are your thoughts, Dominic?
Well, let me rewind a little bit. I agree with the assessment that if Paul Manafort had never worked for President Trump, that he would not be facing these criminal charges today. He would have gotten away. Now, of course, he's presumed innocent until anything else pops up that shows he's guilty. But he would not be facing these political and legal troubles today if not for his involvement with the most powerful man in the world now, that is President Trump. And you can bet your life on it that if Menendez had any connection to President Trump, there would be 200 cameras here every day. I can't really explain that except to say that, right now the media, I guess with any president, the media is very interested in that type of story. Certainly more so with Trump, given that he's a polarizing figure. But with Menendez, we are in a climate right now, having covered Skelos, Silver, and now Menendez, we are in a climate where it looks like a politician could almost do anything in terms of corruption and almost get away with it unless they were stupid enough to draw it up in writing or be on video with it. But at the same token, this takes a tremendous toll on these guys, Menendez, Silver, on their families, and it costs money. I hate to say this, money is almost the root of all evil, and certainly with the American political system. Just look at almost any situation as far as it relates to the question you guys asked about lobbying. But Menendez, remember, he's had to raise millions for his legal defense fund. He's spending millions on this trial, and it's going to cost him millions for an appeal if he's convicted.
Well, I would say not only if you want to talk about money being the root of all evil, that's fine. But I would say that's in the Bible, obviously. But you could make the case that lawyers are the root of all evil, too. I just got to say that because
yes, you could. Yes.
It's lawyers who are getting all this money. I'm just going to point out that lawyers are the one getting it. In fact, Abby Lowell, who's Bob Menendez's attorney, do you have any idea what a guy like Abby Lowell's making off of the Menendez trial? Do we have any sense of that?
Well, I put it to you this way. I don't have an exact number, but Abby Lowell represented House Democrats on impeachment with Bill Clinton, and he's the current lawyer for the president's son-in-law with the Russia investigation. I've heard some people, I can't confirm this, I've heard that this guy bills at like $1,500 an hour. I don't know how accurate that is, but you better believe he's making a ton of money on this case.
The fact of the matter is, I think when lawyers like him, and I've known some, the people that they represent generally don't even really care about the cost. You know what I mean? The people that they represent usually, that it's like the old saying, you know, if you got to ask how much it costs, you can't afford it. They basically write a check and they expect him to get it done, and more often than not, he gets it done.
Well, so Dominic, where do we go from here? Where are we right now? The defense rested. What's happening this week in the trial?
I'm glad you asked that question because it bears pointing out. So in federal trials, once the case is done, and now we know Menendez did not take the stand in his own defense, it would have been nuts to do so because the prosecutors would have had a field day with him. But now that that's over, so today the lawyers are about to arrive from each side, all three sides. Remember, there are two defendants here, and then you have the federal prosecutors. And in federal cases, they work out how the judge is going to give jury instructions. That's extremely important here because that will decide and define whether or not, to a large degree, whether or not Menendez is convicted. And so the lawyers will work that out today in court, in open court. Then tomorrow, Judge Walls will give those instructions to the jury, those 12 members of the jury that have been listening to this case for 8 weeks, 2 months now. And then it's jury deliberations. And we don't know. I can't tell you if they'll be deliberating Friday because in New Jersey, there's been no court on Fridays. We don't know. We're in uncharted territory as of tomorrow afternoon. We don't know what's going to happen after that, except for jury deliberations will start. So probably this week, but certainly next week if they don't start this week.
Well, I can make one prediction. Dominic Carter will be back joining us because we are not letting this go. You know, we try to walk the talk here, Dominic, on this. When we say the media is not covering a story, we try to make sure we cover it. So once again, thanks so much for your great coverage.
Thank you guys for the great radio show and the public service that you do.
Yeah, thanks. Dominic Carter joining us. You can check out his work on Verizon Fios News. They need a shorter name for Dominic. They need something punchier.
Yeah, you know what's interesting about this is when this trial initially started, there was a lot of discussion about the concept that over the premise that at some point that there would be the opportunity for Republicans to replace Bob Menendez with a Republican. And now we see the New Jersey governor's race I'm looking at right now. The Democrat is up 15, almost 16 points. So the odds are overwhelming unless something changes. And we're only like a week or so away from the actual election. The odds are overwhelming. It looks like that's not going to, that dynamic, I guess, was wrong, or is it that's not going to happen?
And it just shows how ineffective apparently the Republican Party in New Jersey is about as effective as the Democrat Party in South Dakota. Just it's a non-starter.
You know what? A lot of that is Chris Christie. Chris Christie was terrible.
I agree, 100% agree.
He was terrible in so many ways.
Yes.
That his party's going to have trouble recovering from his.
As a Republican, I don't think he was. And, you know, Bannon's not a fan of Christie's either.
Yeah, he was terrible in a lot of ways.
He's, terrible across the board. Anyway, thanks again for Dominic Carter joining us. Great guest. We have more coming up. Again, we cover the stories the mainstream media ignores, and we cover them very well. Two great guests so far this morning. We got more coming up, including more on the Manafort indictments. You're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Fault Lines.
We are back with Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan, second hour, third round. In headlines this morning, a third guard has died in the mid-October jailbreak attempt in North Carolina. 2 guards died. During that, another one is held on and just passed away, unfortunately. Rob Rosenstein from the Department of Justice says that there are 4,000 ransomware attacks per day. He said that at a cybersecurity conference recently. Also in the news, of course, the Paul Manafort indictments. Let's talk. We have a guest coming up at 9 o'clock,
yes,
Garland.
We do to talk about that.
Talking about
Former
that.
prosecutor.
But let's talk about Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the press secretary. She had a couple comments about the Manafort indictments. And I got to say, whatever, I get it. What the White House is trying to do is they're trying to distance themselves from the Manafort situation, which is valid. But I got to say, are they throwing Manafort under the bus?
I don't think so.
A little bit?
Because the fact of the matter is, I think what they're doing strategically is they're distancing themselves for this reason. Because the fact of the matter is that the Manafort, the accusations, the indictments aren't related to something that has to do with the president. You know what I mean? They're not related to
Right.
it was before he was the campaign manager. It was before, so it's not related.
Not only
so
that, let's go over this too.
Tactically speaking, it makes sense what they're doing.
If you read the indictment, they talk about the period that Manafort represented this Party of Regions group from 2010 until 2016. Now, do you know what's significant about that? Yanukovych wasn't president of the Ukraine for much of that period.
Right.
They say that in the indictment.
2014, he was gone.
Well, not only that, do you know when he came into office?
No.
It's in the indictment. I want to say 2012.
So according to that, then he was working for whoever the previous ruler, or whatever term you want to use.
Which is not from the party.
Ukraine.
In other words, what they're saying, here's what they're saying. I just want to be clear on this. And can someone get hey, Eric, can you get the date on when Yanukovych came in? I want to get it exactly right. So what the indictment says is that basically this group that it's the Center for Modern Europe or whatever it's called, right? That they were representing this group, and effectively what the indictment's saying is this is really the government of Ukraine. Does that make sense? In other words, because don't forget, part of what they're charging Manafort for is that he did not register as a foreign agent. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So let's say I accuse, there's the Center for Nixonian Research, which is I'm making this up.
Right.
And I represent them for a couple of years. Then Garland Nixon becomes president. What they're saying is that for the couple of years prior to you being president, that I'm really representing the government. That's just flat out false. Do you see what I'm getting at? So if you look at the indictment, they're accusing Manafort of having actually represented the government of Ukraine. However, they're including a time period in the indictment where Yanukovych was not president of Ukraine. That's fascinating to me. And by the way, I haven't seen the media talk about it, but it's right there in the indictment, which mentions the dates and everything else. But that's why I say it's one of the anomalies. We talked earlier. The indictment doesn't mention the Podesta group. The word Podesta doesn't come up. They talk about Company A and Company B. Why not just say Mercury and the Podesta group? Why use euphemisms? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make it clearer. Does that make sense? Like, it doesn't.
When I look at that, and when I look at it, I do think one of the things that I get from it is this, particularly when like I said, the FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act, and that is he's being charged as violating that, and that's something that generally doesn't happen. I mean, you can look it up. They don't charge people with FARA stuff. They allow them to go back and they go back and fill out the paperwork. I don't know if I'm imagine that there's instances where there's been people who have been charged criminally with FARA, but this is a new instance, which leads you to believe that there is some pressure on Mueller to basically come up with all the charges that he can.
Now, there was a case involving this Foreign Agent Registration Act that also involved plumbers and a high-ranking Army official. You may remember this, Garland. It was the Farrah Fawcett Majors incident. Do you remember that?
Yes.
I just made that up.
Well,
now, here's the
let
thing.
me tell you something I would have to say. I would. This is the thing I thought about. When
there was
he
a
got
poster
charged,
about it, I remember.
There is a woman named Alexandra Chalupa.
Yes.
Who worked
I've heard of her.
For the DNC, who worked with people from the Ukrainian government, and is alleged to have lobbied members of Congress to change their activities to support or not support things. And you would have to ask yourself, if Alexandra Chalupa didn't fill out her FARA forms, which there's been some question about whether or not she did, whether or not there's going to be charges there. So there's a lot of questions going on. If I was Alexandra Chalupa, I would be worried, to be honest with you. If I was Alexandra Chalupa, I would be worried because traditionally they haven't been charging people. In my opinion, if they haven't been charging people, they shouldn't charge Alexandra Chalupa or Paul Manafort. But since people are being charged, you got to wonder.
The Ukrainian interference in the election is completely proven. We've discussed it over and over in this show. Alexandra Chalupa, I would not worry if I were Alexandra Chalupa, because this is, in fact, a political witch hunt. The Trump administration is correct on this. The fact that the Podesta group is not named in this indictment shows that Robert Mueller is in the tank for Hillary Clinton and the Democrats. Period.
Well,
that's what it shows.
We will see.
That's what it shows.
We will see because Tony Podesta did step down. So we shall see.
He stepped down to get out of the way. But
we shall see. That fact remains. We got to see what happens here. Tony Podesta's sweating bullets.
Why not mention the Podesta group? If not to cover for the Podesta group. Right. Why not mention them?
Well, whether or not they're mentioned, the time will tell whether or not there's anybody charged.
Okay, so I'm reading from the indictment right now. Between at least 2006 and 2015, Manafort and Gates acted as unregistered agents of the government of Ukraine. Did you hear that? Between 2006 and 2015, as unregistered agents of the government of Ukraine, the Party of Regions, the Ukrainian political party, Viktor Yanukovych, this is right. I'm reading from the indictment here, Garland. So between 2006 and 2015, they were unregistered agents of the government of Ukraine. Next phrase in this sentence. The Party of Regions, open parentheses, a Ukrainian political party whose leader, Viktor Yanukovych, was president from 2010 to 2014. I'm going to say that again. At the beginning of the sentence, they say, from 2006 to 2015, they were unregistered agents of the government of Ukraine. But then they mentioned that Yanukovych was only president from 2010 to 2014.
So they're saying for 4 years or so
5 years,
Yanukovych
they were
was
unregistered. They were actually working for the government that Yanukovych wasn't in charge of. What? This doesn't, like I say, now here's the thing.
Well, I mean, it doesn't mean he couldn't have been working for the previous government. It doesn't.
No, it does mean that because he was working for the party that the guy who was.
Did that party exist before Yanukovych?
Yes.
So then he could have been working for the party, couldn't he?
He was working for the party,
right?
But the party's not the party's not the government. This is exactly the point. The party's not the government. They're saying he was an unregistered agent of the government of Ukraine. And if you wanted to be specific, they represented the Party of Regions. They could have said this in the indictment from 2006 to 2015, period. Then they could say, for the period of 2010 to 2014, Viktor Yanukovych was the president of Ukraine. So therefore, effectively, Manafort was representing. You follow me?
But
that's what they could have said.
Legally, there's a definition. It depends on the FARA definition. It depends on whether or not FARA definition says if you work for a party in another country, you have to do it. So you'd have to read the definition, the FARA definition.
Well, no, I'm reading, but I can read the indictment. The indictment here says it was an unregistered agent of the government of Ukraine.
Right.
That's what it says.
Right.
So what I'm saying is the whole thing is a political witch hunt. That's what it is. The media is in on it. The media is in on it, period. They are in on it as they're always in on it for the establishment. The media is going along with the DNC talking points. And the reason the Podesta group is not named in this indictment is that Mueller is a Hillary Clinton crony. He is acting, I'll put it like this. Mueller is as independent from Hillary Clinton as CrowdStrike was. That's who is.
So I'll say this, Lee.
From.
So I will certainly say that you have the option of giving your opinion. I certainly don't have that
then
opinion.
Then explain to me why the Podesta
I don't have to explain it to you because I'm not taking a position on this. I'm not saying that it was or it wasn't. So I'm not taking a position. So I'm not trying to explain and say you're right or you're wrong. I'm saying, look, that's your opinion, and I respect that in looking at this, that there's questions that are raised. So however you feel, it's legitimate to ask questions. To me, like I said, the big question. But I don't.
Why has there been no investigation into Ukrainian DNC influence? Why?
Well, let me add this. Let me add this about that.
If the establishment is not in the bag for the DNC, that's what I'm saying.
Then the question becomes: here's where the question's raised. There, when you say there isn't, the question is raised that is really raised is the fact of the matter that both the House and the Senate Intel chairs have sent a request to Jeff Sessions to investigate the Ukraine DNC interference. So then the question becomes, why isn't Jeff Sessions has had the request has had written requests from both legislative bodies to look into that. So the question becomes not of anybody else, but then why is Jeff Sessions not looking into it?
And part of the reason is that the media pressure has been on Trump, Russia, Trump, Russia, Trump, Russia.
No, but I mean, Sessions is AG. I mean,
doesn't make any difference.
The media, that's his.
If you want to say that he's not responsive to the media, come on.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, look, internally you have to ask yourself, if the House and Senate Intel Committee, both Republican chairs, send it to the Republican AG and say, look into this. I mean, I'm not saying this from a partisan perspective one way or the other. If you're going to say, how come this hasn't been being looked into, you got to point the finger at Jeff Sessions and say, Jeff, why aren't you looking into it? That's my opinion. I think that's a legitimate.
I can mention
don't you think that's a legitimate position?
I can talk about the environment that's going on here, which is the media pressure plays an absolute factor. By the way, it's the reason, I guarantee you this, why hasn't Breitbart covered this? I've said this before. Breitbart, someone go over to Breitbart. Don't take my word for it. You want to think that Breitbart's, a right-wing site who's doing a good job of defending Trump. I got to say, they've been nowhere on this DNC Ukraine issue. Go look it up. Go look up Alexandra Chalupa's name on the Breitbart site. You'll see almost nothing. Why is that? I guarantee you it's because editors are weak. That's why. Editors don't want to go into something that's outside the news cycle, right? So I guarantee you, if they'd been doing story after story after story in the New York Times about Alexandra Chalupa, you with me? If that had been happening, and about DNC Ukraine interference, you can bet your bottom dollar Breitbart would be covering it.
If I remember correctly,
they're not covering it, and I'm not saying this is not a conspiracy theory.
Didn't even Donald Trump mention something about the DNC Ukraine interference?
He mentioned it. He mentioned it once.
So he even mentioned it. So again, I say you got to ask yourself, if you're a Republican, you got to ask yourself. You got to look. If you're a Republican, you got to look back at Jeff Sessions and say everybody around you has said look into it. I think right now the onus falls not on the media, but there's been, in fact, well, let me add this. The Congress asked him for a special prosecutor or a special investigator to look into it. You have to ask yourself, why hasn't he done that?
It would reveal.
I think he's the responsible party here, if you ask me, if you looked at all the parties around.
You don't understand. I mean, I don't know what to say.
He's still the AG. He's got the power.
If you want to understand, right, if you want to deny what the media does, I don't know how to argue this with you.
I'm not denying anything about the media, but I'm just saying when it comes down to it, the person that could do it is Jeff Sessions. And if you want to hold somebody accountable and put the pressure on somebody, you need to hold the person who can do it and put the pressure on that person and say, why is he doing it?
This is what's interesting. I'm actually arguing for the systemic problem here. This is often what happens. If we get into discussions of race, this comes down to the argument. If we were talking about race issues, it would be, I could bring up an example of individual racism, and the typical progressive argument is, no, you need to talk about systemic racism. What I'm saying is, forget Sessions for a minute. I'm not trying to exonerate Sessions. I'm saying there is a systemic problem, and it involves the incestuous relationship between the media and the political establishment in this country. That's what's going on.
I agree with you on that.
And that's the wide issue here. Now, let's hear what Sarah Sanders, she had a couple things. We have a couple pieces of audio. Here's Sarah Sanders.
Look, today's announcement has nothing to do with the president, has nothing to do with the president's campaign or campaign activity. The real collusion scandal, as we've said several times before, has everything to do with the Clinton campaign, Fusion GPS, and Russia. There's clear evidence of the Clinton campaign colluding with Russian intelligence to spread disinformation and smear the president to influence the election. We've been saying from day one there's been no evidence of Trump-Russia collusion, and nothing in the indictment today changes that at all.
Now, let me say something about that, too, and this is something...
But see, notice who she didn't mention.
Right.
She doesn't mention the DNC-Ukraine collusion.
Yeah. And here's the other thing, and I said this, and this is something I believe very strongly right now. You know, we're playing, you know, light matches in the powder magazine and see who'll drop it first. I make this point. The United States and Russia have 95% of all nuclear weapons on this earth. If we're going to get wiped out in the near future, that's what would happen. And I think it is very irresponsible that in this country that we've gotten to the point now. We've now gotten to the point that both parties are saying, you're a Russian conspirator. Right. No, you're the Russian. And I agree with you. The Clinton people, the Podesta people, the Center for the American Progress people started this crap, and it was madness, and it's irresponsible. But now we've sunk to a point where everybody's standing around, and now we've got a boogeyman. Well, and unfortunately, the boogeyman has just as many nuclear nukes pointing as us, and we have pointing at them, and we're playing a very dangerous game.
And here's why. Because the political establishment in this country backed the coup in Ukraine that got Yanukovych thrown out. So what nobody can admit, Republican or Democrat, and by the way, the Trump administration has gone along with this. When Petro Poroshenko, who runs Ukraine now, came to the White House, he was greeted as a friend and an ally, correct?
Yep.
By the Trump White House. So what I'm saying is, this goes along with what John Kiriakou said yesterday, okay? This is the game that the CIA and the establishment plays. And Kiriakou summed it up very, very well. He said, when you're the president, the first time they sit you down, I don't care who you are, Obama or Trump, I don't care who you are, and they say, Mr. President, we have a briefing. We'd like to let you know what we're doing around the world. Here's our briefing, and they hand it to you. That's pretty powerful.
And you're in awe. You're like, wow, we can do that?
Right. That's exactly right. So what happens is the establishment is able to get whoever is in the Oval Office on their side on this stuff. Because if the American, once again, I got to say, what we know for sure happened in Ukraine, because Victoria Nuland said it in a speech that you can go listen to. The U.S. spent $5 billion there. We know that. We picked who would take over. That was a coup that the U.S. backed. And who was on it? It was the Democrats, right? Well, yeah. It was Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. It was the Republicans, right? Yes.
John McCain.
It was Lindsey Graham and John McCain.
Yep.
It was all of them. And the reality here is the reason Sarah Sanders can't mention Ukraine is because the establishment has gotten Trump to buy in on Ukraine.
And there's so many people on both sides of the aisle that are mixed up in that they don't want ever to open that can of worms.
That's exactly my point. We got more coming up. We're going to be talking to someone looking into the details in this indictment. Jonathan Jeffries, former federal public defender, will be joining us in the next hour. Look, hey, this is why we're the most disruptive radio show in America, bringing the truth 7 days a week, 7 to 10, Monday through Friday. You're listening to the most disruptive radio show in America. It's Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Fault Lines.
From Washington, D.C., it's time for the third hour of the show that brings you all sides of the issues that matter. In the right corner, I am Republican investigative reporter Lee Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I'm political analyst and progressive Democrat Garland Nixon.
Get ready. It's time for the most disruptive radio show in America. It's Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan. Joining us next will be Jonathan Jeffries. I got his name wrong. It's sad when a radio host is blind, Garland. as I am. Jeff Ress will be joining us, former federal prosecutor, to talk about the top story right now, which is the Paul Manafort indictment. Robert Mueller, who was appointed as special counsel, indicted Paul Manafort and associate Rick Gates yesterday. They are both under house arrest right now, having to check in. Hopefully they're listening on 105.5 FM inside the Swampway, because they could be. He's in Alexandria. Paul Manafort's in Alexandria.
He could listen.
Alexandria, he's not in Alexandria.
Well, if he didn't listen, he could always go to @Stranahan and he could watch your Periscope feed.
Well done. By the way, Paul Manafort, when you're on Twitter, follow @GarlandNixon. Let's just see if he follows you. They're both under house arrest after pleading not guilty, and we'll be talking about those indictments coming up soon. John Kelly, Chief of Staff, has come out and said these happened long before Manafort or Gates ever met Donald Trump, which is true. Also, they had a former foreign policy advisor, Papadopoulos, who pled guilty already to charges of lying to federal authorities. That's what got Martha Stewart in trouble.
It'll get you.
Right?
That will get you.
That will get you. Also, in other headlines, Bo Bergdahl, Army deserter, continues his sentencing hearing today at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. Bergdahl did 2 hours of testimony yesterday where he described the conditions he was in while being held by the Taliban after he deserted his post. Meanwhile, U.S. Special Ops have captured someone they say was involved in the 2012 attack in Benghazi, Libya. They'll be facing trial here in Washington.
And survivors of the Las Vegas shooting earlier this month have been accused of acting by online trolls and conspiracy theorists. Rob McIntosh, who was shot in the chest and arm, told The Guardian, "It makes you angry. You've already been through something that's traumatic and terrible, and you have someone who is attacking your honesty."
There we go. That's headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan. Want to get right to our guest. Jonathan Jeff Ress is joining us. He's a former federal public defender. Jonathan, how you doing this morning?
Good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Good, and sorry about getting your name wrong. I'm sure no one's ever gotten your name wrong before.
Oh, actually, you were very close.
Yeah, it was pretty close. But let's talk about this. So first off, you've read the indictment, I take it?
Yes, I did.
So tell us your take on the indictment and the charges.
As might be expected from special counsel who has a reputation for investigating matters thoroughly and who certainly wouldn't want to rush any kind of prosecution. It's an extremely detailed indictment alleging a very, I wouldn't say complicated, but lengthy, and it's 31 pages. It has a lot of detail about the nature of the money laundering transactions, which it traces them in pretty good detail and lays out exactly what they believe Manafort and Gates did wrong here. And what's sort of shocking is that it's really not all that complicated. There were a lot of transactions, but they're fairly easy to follow. And you see that, what it looks like from the outside, at least, is that those would have only been done for one purpose, which is to conceal the nature of the money flow.
Now, does that sound? Now, one of the things with Garland and I were talking about this earlier. I don't know. I mean, this idea of using shell corporations to put money through, that doesn't seem to me to be like, in other words, let me come at it this way. What I'm not seeing in the indictment is that there was some secret company or some, that they found something. A lot of these corporations that were listed in the indictment, and as you say, there is a lot of detail. A number of them are just known. The money flowed through. And in fact, the attorney for Manafort said that he called this ridiculous, saying that the idea of using shell companies to move money around is a crime, is ridiculous. So,
well, I think his point is that this happens all the time.
Yeah.
On that score, he's 100% correct. There's no question.
Right. So I think one of the discussion here and I can't call it a legal defense, you know, and to some extent that everybody does it. But I think part of the discussion is going to be, I think in the public forum with the Manafort defense is going to be, look, this is a very, very common instance. And though it may be illegal, you know, if you're not going to go after everyone that does it, which is, you know, pretty much everybody making like 200,000 and above, or that moves international money, but that if you're not going to go after everybody, that it's kind of an unfair selection of Manafort. Do you think the defense may go in some direction with that?
I think you're absolutely right. You got to divide it up between what the defense is going to be in the public sphere for the purpose of dealing with the media, and then what they're allowed to present in court. And certainly, they've already begun that defense with Mr. Downing's statement in front of the courthouse yesterday with respect to the media. But whether you're really not. I seriously doubt that the judge is going to let you get very far if you attempt to present that defense to a jury, because it's not a real legal defense.
Right.
Now, one of the interesting things about this in the indictment, maybe you can explain this because we've talked about this a little on the show. It doesn't mention there were two companies that were doing the lobbying, Mercury and the Podesta Group.
Right.
In the indictment, they don't mention either of those companies, as far as I can see. And as you say, it's a 31-page indictment, and it's possible, and I have bad eyesight, and it's possible I missed it, but I didn't see it. I did a search. I didn't find it in either one. Why would you say in the indictment, Company A and Company B, rather than, I understand if you have a confidential informant, and so if Garland Nixon's my confidential informant, I don't say, Garland Nixon told me. You say, confidential informant Smith
Source
or whatever.
A, whatever. B, yeah.
Why would in this indictment? I mean, again, I'm not asking you to just as an attorney who's seen a few of these things. Why would you just not mention the company's names? Why would you put in Company A, Company B?
It's actually a fairly common practice for unindicted entities or individuals not to be named by the grand jury.
Okay.
I think it's sort of an extension of grand jury secrecy, which is meant to protect a lot of things, but one thing it's meant to protect is the identity of individuals or entities that haven't been indicted, so that they're not part of the same whirlwind that Mr. Manafort and Mr. Gates are part of right now.
I think that makes sense because then
people
would begin speculating.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, and if you have a company, then a company could certainly argue, my name's in an indictment. They threw me in there, and I haven't done anything wrong. If they haven't, and it could affect your business. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, what about the FARA charges? As I've said, my understanding of FARA and my experience is that for the most part, when people violate the rules, they allow them to go back and to fill out the paperwork. But in this seems to be kind of a new direction in the enforcement of those laws, and that somebody's actually being charged now. Are you familiar with that dynamic?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There have been very few criminal prosecutions for FARA violations, and you're absolutely right. This is unusual in that respect. I think it could be a couple of things. One is that it was pretty blatant here. I think another thing is that, Manafort's been given an opportunity to cooperate, it sounds like, and, he hasn't wanted to take advantage of that. He's continued to fight. So, they may have felt like, well, the full court press is appropriate here. And then the third thing is the thing I think that a lot of people are talking about, which is that this whole indictment seems perhaps designed to produce Manafort, to lead Manafort to cooperate by using the full court press and everything else and charging with everything they can. They're hoping to get the maximum leverage to get him to start talking about other things that aren't brought up in this.
Now, we talked about before also, and maybe you can explain this. The indictment talks about a period of 2010 to 2016, but Viktor Yanukovych was president from, forgive me, the indictment talks about a period of 2006 to 2015. But Yanukovych was president from 2010 to 2014. So it would seem like if they're saying that by lobbying for this group connected to the Party of Regions, you're actually acting on the behalf of the Ukraine government, that would only apply when Yanukovych, it would seem like it would only apply when Yanukovych was actually president. Am I missing something there, or?
No, I don't think so. I think that's right with respect to those allegations. It would only be for that charge period.
And so, we hinted at this before, but let's just talk about this. When an indictment comes out like this, how much of it is actually meant to lay out a narrative for the public? In other words, knowing that this is a public document, how much awareness is there on the part of prosecutors that they are basically and again, I'm not trying to diminish it, but they're kind of issuing a press release, right? In a weird way, they're kind of saying, like, look, this is our public case. How much of an awareness do prosecutors have that that's what they're doing? They're laying out a very public narrative that the media is going to pick up on.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely the case. Well, and it's very interesting. I mean, defense lawyers like myself, sometimes we would prefer it to be just a bare bones indictment, which is the government can do. They can allege, they could have just put, the charges, just listed the counts, and that would have been a valid indictment likely. But instead, they do what we call a speaking indictment, like this, which runs, 31 pages in length. It gives all kinds of details to everyone. It gives details to the defense, which the defense generally appreciates. The more information you can have, the better.
Right.
The flip side of it in this case is that it's also being read by a lot of people, including a lot of people in your guys' line of work, who are going to, project the details and speculate about all the different, factual assertions all day long. So, it's sort of a double-edged sword. You want the details of a defense lawyer, but on the other hand, you're right. It acts as sort of a press release, and the fear that defense lawyers have is it's going to taint the jury pool.
I got a question regarding Farah, and that is, when you look, if in fact everything is correct in the indictment, then Paul Manafort was at least some point working for the government, and he was lobbying members of Congress on behalf of the government of Ukraine, which is a pretty clear FARA violation, if in fact that's all correct. My question is this: why would someone not want to register with FARA? Why would they not want to do that? Is there something in it for them? Is there some incentive? Do they make more money? Does it somehow impede their ability to lobby? Why would, if it is as written, what would be the advantage of Paul Manafort not registering under FARA? It creates a public record of your representation of those individuals, which can be used against you, in politics, basically in the political sphere. So I think in this case, that's his motive. Is he just didn't want it out there that he was acting as sort of a lobbyist for Ukraine, for Russia, basically. But I think, in some cases, you just don't want that information out there, and so you just rather keep it concealed. That seems like what the alleged motive is here.
Now, I have read a good explanation of how lawyers read and write that's different than us regular people. Not knocking you as a lawyer. I'm not biased. I've dated a lawyer American before, so it's not that I'm not against them personally. But what this explanation said is that basically what lawyers often read and write in code. In other words, if a lawyer writes a letter, another lawyer will read it and go, okay, here's what they're really saying. This is what they're saying, right? But so as a former federal public defender, what are you reading in this indictment? What's the code that a lot of lay people might not be seeing here?
It is most certainly that, we've got you dead to rights. Like, we're not messing around. Look at the kind of detail we've been able to amass here. Look at the kind of records that we've been able to review here. We have everything that we need to prove your guilt. And if you don't either plead guilty or, even better, plead guilty and start cooperating with us about other matters outside the scope of this case, you are going to prison for a long time. I mean, that's the message. It's a shot across the bow, no question. They are looking for Manafort to provide information about the real mandate of the special counsel, which is the Russia connection.
You see, Garland, that's that code thing.
Yeah, and
it would be nice if there were like a paragraph that said that. Right.
So then that creates this for Paul Manafort, one of two things, and that is, if in fact, so they want something for Russia collusion. So if there's something with Russia collusion, he can give it to him. But if there isn't, then he doesn't have anything to play with. He doesn't have anything to bargain with. And then he'd have to go to something else and say, okay, I don't know anything on the Russia collusion. However, if you're a lobbyist and international lobbyist, you know stuff on somebody, he's going to have to start rolling on people somewhere, some kind of way to try to get himself out of it. If in fact there is no Russia collusion, which we don't know whether there is or not, then he's in a jam, isn't he?
It, certainly.
Yeah, and you never want to prejudge things based on a prosecutor's indictment. Okay?
Right.
You really got to look at the real evidence. I mean, we've heard from one side and one side only, which has had a lot of time to prepare that document. So, you have to take all of this with a grain of salt. But the way they're painting Manafort is as somebody who has, could potentially have information about a lot of different things.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. And again, thanks so much. We're joined by Jonathan Jeffress. He's a former federal public defender. Thanks so much. We really appreciate you taking the time this morning.
Thanks for having me.
You bet.
What we're seeing here, Lee, is, man, this is a rabbit hole that could, again, here's what I think about it. It's just like the way this happened, and now Tony Podesta is potentially in some legal jeopardy. If you open this whole Ukraine door, I think there's a potential that the people who opened this door at some point could be very sorry they opened it.
Well, they could if they listened to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan. If, however, they read the New York Times, and I'm not joking. I mean, here's the thing. I've talked about it a bunch, but going over this JFK stuff that I've been going over, the thing that's very depressing to me, I don't know how else to put it, is how long this game's been going on. Working as a journalist, I hear people say stuff all the time like, well, journalism used to be good. No, it didn't used to be good. Journalism, especially in this town, has always been a game of intimidation and holding information.
And access. That's the way they control you. Because if you go against the grain, you lose access. And if you're a journalist and you can't get in the door and nobody will listen to you and nobody will talk to you, guess what? You can't get any work done. Nobody will pick up your story.
And so this prosecution thing, this in a very real sense, I've never seen any evidence Manafort has anything on Russian collusion at all. So in that case, what's happening here is the full force of the government and the media is coming down on Paul Manafort when he doesn't have anything to give. It's like trying to get someone to confess to something that they can't confess to. And it should be disturbing. And the media should be asking questions, but they won't. We got more coming up. You're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. Don't forget, you can go to at Stranahan and you can watch us. You can watch us live on the Periscope feed. And don't forget, you can always share that with your friends. You can watch it later, and multiple episodes are there. And you can certainly go to iTunes and you can review. You can leave a review. You can leave a 5-star rating, and you can subscribe. And we have with us now David Swanson, author, activist, radio host. He has and a multiple Nobel Peace Prize nominee. Welcome to Fault Lines, Dave.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks for being on. And for those of you who don't know about David, he was the guy who exposed the Downing Street memos. We could start we could just start there. If you could just give a very brief background about that, so people know about that, Dave.
That was a record, an official minutes of a meeting that happened at 10 Downing Street with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and his top cabinet officials that made the news in May 2005, but it happened back in the summer of 2002, and this was a meeting at which the head of British intelligence was just back from Washington, having met there with George Tenet, the head of the CIA, and he was reporting reporting to his British colleagues that the U.S. was dead set on going to war in Iraq and was going to lie about it as needed. It was going to lie about the weapons and the ties to terrorism and so forth in order to get the war that they wanted. And this was, of course, for months after this, of course, Blair and Bush were pretending that they were trying to avoid war and war would be a last resort and the whole routine that they always go through. So, it's typical of U.S. wars and most wars around the world. You have to pretend that it's, your last resort, whatever in the world that could mean, because there are always other choices than war, while carefully maneuvering to get the war to happen. Just as racism has to be carefully taught, you have to go to great extremes to avoid peace at all costs if you're going to get a war, and this is what they do.
Now, when you look at the situation, have you looked at this Manafort indictment? Because that's the news of the morning. We want to talk to you about other stuff. But do you have an immediate take on this Manafort indictment?
Well, I don't know where it will lead, and I am in favor of rooting out and holding accountable all variety of financial criminality. That being said, the Russiagate madness has morphed considerably from where it started. You may recall that it started as a change of conversation from the Democratic Party rigging its own primary. Let's not talk about that. Let's talk about who we blame without any evidence for leaking the information to the public, which
that's right.
Supposedly the Russian government. It then expanded into an excuse not to talk about the fact that by rigging its primary, the Democratic Party gave itself a losing candidate. So now, rather than talk about that, and it is largely the work of that losing candidate pushing this story, but there's nothing in what's come out recently that's connected to Russia, and there's very little, if anything, connected to Trump or the election, much less, connected to both Russia and the election. So it's really become this media obsession with anything Russian, to the point of including anything that ties Hillary Clinton and her team to Russia, so that just any connection to Russia is somehow nefarious. And I find that more dangerous than the financial shenanigans, which, there's not a state in this country, there are probably few countries on this planet where Trump or some crony of Trump hasn't engaged in some, less than reputable business practice. Why pick the ones that have some connection to Russia and make them part of a scandal that supposedly is related to election theft?
Well, and the thing I've noticed, too, is that when you look at it, and again, this has been reported, the way the American propaganda machine works is not that they never report the facts. It's that what they emphasize over and over and over again every day becomes the news narrative. So you can find this in the New York Times, you just have to dig. The New York Times has reported that Paul Manafort, in fact, was urging the government of Ukraine to move away from Russia. Now, this runs completely counter-narrative because the idea is that Manafort is Putin's puppet or something like that. But in fact, what he was urging Yanukovych to do was, hey, back off from Putin a little bit. And that's what he was clearly urging him to do, according to the New York Times. So, and again, I'm like you. I don't agree with, I don't like the lobbying industry in this country. I don't like the way influence gets peddled with American politicians, which is why Mercury and the Podesta Group were hired. I don't like that. That being said, to completely mischaracterize this, I think the other thing that they're clearly trying to cover up for is what the U.S. actually did to foment the revolution in Ukraine that knocked Yanukovych out of power. If Yanukovych had been impeached, let's say, I would have no problem with that. If Yanukovych had been lost in an election, I wouldn't have any problem with that. The issue I have is that there was a coup that the U.S. was behind very clearly, And that's what got him out. So, I mean, are you seeing that at all as well, or is it just me?
Well, I don't think there's really any serious threat of that story entering the U.S. corporate media. It's been effectively silenced for years. But I think it is important, of course, to U.S. government propagandists and their allies to maintain the idea that the U.S. had nothing to do with, Russian aggression in Ukraine and Russian seizure of Crimea and so forth, which I am no supporter of Russian war making in Chechnya or Georgia or Syria or anywhere else. I'm opposed to everybody's war making. But the U.S. story is falsified because it leaves out the fact that there had been a coup, the fact that Crimea was seceding by democratic choice from a coup government. That's not permitted in the U.S. news.
Well, one of the things, Dave, I want to ask you about, and this is a point I've been making a lot lately on social media, and that is, even today, I think, or within the last day, Sarah Huckabee Sanders has talked about the Clintons, uranium one deal, et cetera. And this has been my point. 95% of all nuclear weapons on this earth are owned by the U.S. and Russia, and we are playing a very dangerous game. Now it's gotten to the point where the Trump administration is saying, aha, but you guys are, Russian puppets. And then of course, the other side's like, oh, the Trump people are all Russian puppets. And what we've gotten to a point where the boogeyman is a real boogeyman in that all it would take was for one screw up for either side to wipe out all humanity. And I'm upset that this dangerous game is being played between the two. This political football is the nuclear football, and the game that's being played by clearly started with Clinton in the Center for American Progress people. But now we are risking all life on earth for domestic politics in America. That's the way I see it. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, on that perspective?
Well, I think the motivations include domestic politics, include weapons profiteering, include simply irrational, sadistic motivations in individuals in Washington, D.C. But when you have Donald Trump threatening total elimination of a country, when you have Senator John McCain talking about extermination, and these threats playing right into the popular and accurate understanding in North Korea of what was done to North Korea over a half century ago, and you have North Korea having largely agreed and complied with an agreement to end its nuclear program, back in the 90s. North Korea saying year after year, we're willing to negotiate, but stop the threats, stop the militarization of South Korea, stop the practice bombing runs. Stop threatening us with genocide, and we will negotiate. You have Jimmy Carter, who successfully negotiated with North Korea, saying, go negotiate with North Korea, or, I think Trump should send Jimmy Carter to do it. You have Mikhail Gorbachev saying, I worked with Ronald Reagan. Putin and Trump need to sit down and talk. It's not rocket science. There's no, particular genius or new information needed to understand what has to be done here. But thus far, the Trump White House is just not interested. The U.S. media is dishonestly telling the U.S. public that North Korea will not negotiate, period. And Donald Trump is telling North Korea, we will negotiate as soon as you agree to absolutely everything we want before sitting down. Then we'll negotiate. Well, that's not how you negotiate. And it is indeed a risk to the entire planet. And it's a measure of the level of ignorance and misinformation that have people suggesting that you can go have a war in North Korea that only kills North Koreans, or perhaps South Koreans, who cares about them either, and won't affect the rest of the world. Nuclear war will impact the climate of the globe for everybody.
What about now? One thing we haven't gotten into, and that is the Niger issue, and you've been talking about this now for many years, not just in recent years, and that is the fact that we've got And it's just happening more and more. This thing is a snowball rolling downhill. But now we're finding out that we've got troops all over the world in who knows how many countries. And it's like our military is, the military actions seem to be just out of control, and who knows where we're fighting. And this has been going on for many, many years. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, if you go to worldbeyondwar.org, you can find maps that try to keep up to date with where all the bases are, where all the troops are. The U.S. now has troops in virtually every, if not every, country on the continent of Africa. And I don't mean just a handful of troops guarding an embassy, but thousands of troops now all over Africa with big expansion plans. And the terrorism predictably and consistently following these so-called counterterrorism efforts. Just as the entire war on terrorism has predictably increased terrorism, and the bulk of the world's terrorism now comes out of the liberated and democratized Iraq and Afghanistan. These steps are counterproductive, predictably and consistently counterproductive, producing violence rather than reducing it, but generating profits for the war industries and generating pins on a map for these madmen in Washington that want to dominate the globe. But Niger is a story not because the U.S. military is there or killing lots of people, but because some U.S. troops, 4 U.S. troops, died. This at a time when the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are taking actions in Yemen that are killing people by the thousands and threatening millions and millions of deaths from famine and disease created by that war. I mean, Niger ranks below Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, Pakistan, Libya, numerous places where the United States is engaged in serious murder right now. Africa is a new story, and Americans died there, and Trump said awful things to the family of someone who died. But the ignorance is incredible in the United States of the war. People can't keep track of the number of wars going on, and that one at this point is a small one.
Now, one of the things, let's talk about the media role in all of this stuff. As somebody who follows these issues closely, let's take Yemen. How much media coverage are you seeing of what's going on in Yemen right now?
For years now, my view has been that if the famine and disease epidemics and the general disaster and horror in Yemen had been created by something other than U.S. war making, it would be, one of the top stories in the U.S. news.
Like Russian hacking had been behind it, let's say, something like that.
Sure. And if anybody else had been behind it, but especially if some designated enemy had been behind it, if you could blame the whole thing on Russia or China or Iran, then it would even more so. But even if it were, just some neutral cause, some natural cause, it would be a major, major story, and relief efforts would be a major story. And of course, those relief efforts would likely involve trying to insert the U.S. military into Yemen, but it would be a major story. Instead, because it comes out of Obama's quote-unquote successful drone war in Yemen and comes out of U.S. and Saudi war making, and of course very bipartisan, none of this mythical gridlock in Washington war making with not just the Trump gang, but also the Clinton Family Foundation taking millions from Saudi Arabia and from Boeing and elsewhere, to make this happen. It's just not a comfortable story. And even when, people like Samantha Power have tried to bring it up as if they had nothing to do with creating it, it hasn't played as a story because it very quick. I mean, this is my interpretation. I think a large part of it is because it inevitably goes to U.S. crimes. And in fact, this is the one area where there's a major push on Capitol Hill in Congress to do something about any of the U.S. wars. There is a major effort that has a chance in Congress to block U.S. participation and block U.S. weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, and even that is not a story.
Yeah, and like you say, I mean, that's people like Rand Paul, for instance, a Republican, has raised significant issues on Saudi Arabia and the arms sales. And then you get the spectacle of, for instance, Jared Kushner, and this was reported, literally picking up the phone and placing a call to the... I
think it was Lockheed Martin.
The head of Lockheed Martin, yeah, my neighbor in Crystal City, to the head of Lockheed Martin to negotiate the deal for Saudi Arabia. It's bizarre. Now, again, some of that stuff gets covered. It gets mentioned. This is the thing we were talking about, Garland. The way the media works on this stuff is they just pound on a story. So they'll mention it because Kushner doing that was news, but it was like a one-day news cycle. That's it.
But the other part we get to, Dave, is this when we talk about the media, and that is the New York Times is owned by the majority owner, Carlos Slim, the fifth richest man in the world. The Washington Post, owned by Jeff Bezos, who has a CIA contract. The question becomes: do we really even have a media anymore? I don't call it a media if it's owned by the oligarchs.
Yeah, well, it's not. I mean, the outlets you named, the New York Times, Washington Post, are not media that anyone should rely on or trust or support or subscribe to or advertise in. But they remain outlets that sometimes produce news that you haven't got from anywhere else. But typically, if you aren't looking at a variety of news sources, including news sources about a country from outside that country,
right?
I mean, for U.S. news, I rely first and foremost on British news outlets and secondarily on outlets from all around the globe about what's happening in the U.S., as well as smaller, more independent news sources. I would recommend to my friends in Russia that they look for Russian news from outside of Russia and anywhere else in the world. If you aren't looking for independence in the provision of news, you're in trouble. And
Dave, hate to cut you off, but we've run out of time for the segment. But if you would, I understand you recently had a trip to Russia. If you could stay for a few minutes into the next segment, I'd like to get a little bit of information about. I'd like you to talk about that if you'd be available too.
Sure thing.
Okay, great. We'll stand by. We'll get right back to you. We'll take a break. You are listening to Fault Lines on 105.5 FM with Nixon and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Fault Lines.
You're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon Stranahan. Final hour, final segment for today. Thanks so much to all of our guests today, including Jonathan Jeffress, who helped explain the Manafort indictment, which is kind of top of the news cycle. We're bringing you the best coverage about it you're going to find anywhere. Hey, we got a caller, too. You can join the show, 202-521-1320. We have David Swanson, who's director of World Beyond War. We're holding him over for the segment. But before we get back to David, Rachel from Memphis has a question about the indictment. Yeah, go ahead, Rachel.
Well, it's kind of related to the indictment. It's more about the timing of the indictment with the JFK files that were released over the weekend. And then also there was a very important hearing with Mattis and Tillerson on the authorization of the use of military force late yesterday afternoon, early evening. And so the timing, I wondered if you guys thought that it was highly suspect because the hearing on the authorization of use of military force, the Mattis and Tillerson basically demanded that they should have no geographical limitation of operations, they should have no time constraints, and they should have no limits on operations as well, which I don't know if you find that terrifying, but I sure do. I'm really just kind of uneasy about how this is being blacked out from the media, where they basically are having free reign to carry out whatever operations in the shadows all over the globe without the public knowing anything about it and the media not educating the public about it.
Well, there's two things about that. First off, let me tell you the way I approach this broadly, Rachel, and thanks for the call. First off, I do believe sometimes stories come out to bury other stories. That happens. But let's balance that with the idea that correlation doesn't equal causation. And let me balance it out with something else here. There is no point that this indictment could have been dropped that you could not point to other events and go, well, gee, if it had come out 2 weeks ago, you would have found something, not you, but
somebody would have, yeah.
Anybody looking at would have been able to find something and go, hey, you know what? This was covering up this or that. So to me, I think that Mueller is on his own schedule. I don't see any reason to think that this indictment, there's nothing, let me tell you what else. I heard people saying last week, oh, well, gee, just at the same time that news has dropped about Hillary Clinton and the Democrats behind Fusion GPS. Let me tell you what else.
Let me tell you where I'm going to give you some timing pressure.
Let me just say this. Here's what I said at the time. I said, well, it's also coming out during the second game of the World Series.
Right.
Right. I can point to things always.
Well, here's the other part too, and here's the if you want to focus on timing and Mueller, here's the timing you want to focus at because of the Clinton accusations about the FBI releasing a statement just prior to the election. Here's my thoughts. Mueller is going to want to try to get this stuff done as soon as possible because he's not going to want to be accused of affecting the midterms. That's the only timing line you'll see about that. But what's interesting, and I know Dave is going to want to talk about it, was that Mattis basically said a new authorization for use of a military force is not even required, that they can go attack any place and any time they want without one. So I know Dave will have some issues with that, as do I.
Yeah, David Swanson from World Beyond War.
Well, yes, this is a claim that has been made by the Trump administration and was made by the Obama administration and was made by the Bush administration, that there is secret, in invisible ink, presidential powers in the Constitution that you and I are too stupid to find that let the president make war whenever and wherever he wants, with or without the authorization for the use of military force, or much less, an actual congressional declaration of war, as the Constitution actually says. And this is, this is one side of the debate. The other side of the debate is if Congress would just properly authorize each war, then they would be legal. This is the position of the New York Times. Whereas, in fact, if some other country were to attack the United States, the U.S. media wouldn't have a big debate over whether, China had, gone through proper procedures in its legislature under the Chinese Constitution. Who the hell gives a damn? A war is a crime, and neither Congress nor the president has the power to make it legal. It is a crime under the United Nations Charter and under the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And so it's an additional violation of the Constitution for the president to do it without Congress. But neither one of them has the power to make it legal. And I think it's that sort of discussion that all of this is a distraction from. And, things like Russiagate are an ongoing distraction. But I agree that there's no evidence of particular timing here. I think what's most disturbing about what the caller asked is that she asked about the timing of the JFK papers being released. The story there is that the vast bulk of the JFK papers were not released, and Trump has put one over on the general public with the help of the media there, where the story has come out that's the opposite of what he did.
Well, and in fact, Trump also said that he was ahead of schedule, and he wasn't ahead of schedule. This was something that was set back in the 90s, basically, that the release was supposed to happen.
Small percentage of the stuff on the very last day possible. And then Trump tweeted, I released all the JFK papers ahead of schedule. Well, what in the world is he talking about? But if a president says it, it can't be. You can't call a president a liar. This has been the approach of the U.S. media for decades.
Well, it depends on the issue.
Yeah,
because
the other thing
for
is,
instance, NBC, who's been a real harsh critic of Trump, came out with some horrible reporting on the JFK files release, and there is some interesting stuff in there, but a lot of it has been. By the way, a lot of the JFK file stuff is not new, as you point out. I mean, a lot of it's simply retreads. There's a couple of things that are new, but a lot of it's just retreads.
Well, one of the things I want to touch base on is I understand that you had made a trip to Russia recently, and maybe you could tell us, how that came about and what that was all about.
I went with a group called the Center for Citizen Initiatives that's run by a wonderful woman out of California named Sharon Tennyson who used to take, hundreds and thousands of U.S. and Soviet citizens back and forth during the earlier stage of the Cold War back in the 80s, 90s, and I guess more in the 80s. And this was the second trip since she started this up again due to the new tensions, the new Cold War. This was back in May that a lot of us went to Russia and met with, people of all political persuasions, support and opposition of the government, journalists, doctors, students. I had a good, got a good sense of what people were thinking in Russia to the extent we could in a matter of weeks, and now coming up in January, the same group is going to start bringing Russians to the United States for the same purpose, to better inform each other, to make human connections, to be able to go back to your respective country and say, hey, I went to that country and I met people, not monsters. So I think it's something that more groups need to be doing much more of. I think it actually was of great benefit during the last Cold War.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. Let me ask this: what was the makeup of the people involved? Because what you're saying, I actually think, when this was going on in the Soviet era, this was largely a liberal exercise, it would seem to me. This is largely something that was happening on the left. Today, I think you would get a lot of people who identify as conservative or Republican who would be interested. I think that there's a lot of people, I say this as somebody on the right, I think a lot of people on the right are like, they think that the whole Russiagate thing is fishy. And maybe it's partisan. Maybe it's happened because they see it's being used against Trump, who they view as one of their own. But I think also part of it is a general sense of skepticism about what the media is trying to sell people. So do you think, is there any attempt at reaching out to get a broad cross-section of different political persuasions to go on trips like this?
In fact, this particular group, Center for Citizen Initiatives, in its recent trips and back in the day, has made a concerted effort and been very successful in working with people from across the political spectrum.
That's great to hear, yeah.
More sort of business leaders and entrepreneurs than anything else from both sides, and of course there's the other problem that, when I was on this trip in Moscow back in May, in my hometown here in Charlottesville, Virginia, there was a Nazi rally with people chanting, racist slogans around a Confederate general statue and chanting, "Russia is our friend, Russia is our friend." And I'm having to answer questions from Russians in Moscow that what in the world are they talking about? We aren't in favor of slavery. We didn't even have slavery. We had serfdom. It's totally different. Not comprehending at all that where these people were coming from was a sort of, racist view and political view of, buying into the idea that Russia gave Trump the White House and promoting Russia as fellow white people. The future of white people must include the Russians. And, I don't think, so that right-wing perspective of, friendship to Russia is not one I want to encourage, and not one I think many people in Russia that I spoke with even understood,
So let me ask you this question. There are a lot of people, and I see this, there are a lot of progressives who don't buy into the Russiagate narrative. A lot of the people, Bernie supporters and points left, which is where I fall in. And a lot of times when you don't buy into that, or you don't buy into any of the mainstream stuff, you get attacked as a Russian bot. Having gone, I know you, I've known you, having been worked on anti-war campaigns, I've known of you doing that, like I said, going back to the early 2000s. Do you have that issue where you have people go after you, oh, you've been to Russia, or you're a Russian, buy Putin lover, all of that kind of stuff, the attacks that come to the left now? Have you had to deal with any of that?
Well, it hasn't disrupted my life very much, but certainly I hear a bit of that. Certainly numerous publications that I've written for have been denounced, even in the Washington Post, as, servants of Russia, although I've never gotten a dime from most of those publications, much less from Russia. And in fact, I've declined to go on trips to Russia paid for by Russian media, like the one that our friend Jill Stein went on and will forever be condemned by a photograph of it, just because of the hassle of that sort of criticism. But, I go on Russian media and criticize the Russian government and Russian war-making, just like U.S. war-making. And the Russian...
Almost like you did in this segment this morning.
Yeah, and you might have me back on.
Of course we would, yeah.
I go on U.S. media and criticize U.S. war making. I never hear from them again, right? It's not acceptable. I do get that sort of criticism, but I get a lot more heated and more, actual threats of violence and so forth when I criticize U.S. wars. I get emails all the time now telling me if I don't turn around my position, I better start learning to speak North Korean and the ISIS language and all these non-existent languages, because it's taking on the U.S. role in the world that generates the most passionate hatred in people who bother to contact me anyway.
Well, and it's interesting too, because we invite, Garland and I, when people are critical of us, we always invite them on the show. Our producers, I always tell them, if somebody comes out with something that's critical of stuff that we're doing, I say, well, let's invite them on the show. They never show up. So we openly invite criticism. We had NBC just did a piece on me. I invited the producer, which we had her on the show briefly, but she didn't want to talk about issues like Ukraine, for instance. We talked about that in the interview later, Garland.
You're right.
She didn't want to talk about it here, but I would have loved it if she talked about it. We don't, I can speak for our show. Our show, Garland and I, and the producers we work with, we set the show. And then it's 3 hours of us talking about it. So if a guest like you comes on and talks about Russia war making, we're not looking at Andre going, hit the
dump button.
Hit the dump button. Yeah, get that guy out of here. We don't do that at all. And that just, it's interesting that that's your experience as well in dealing with the so-called Russian, it's not so-called, but the Russian propaganda media. That's what I'm getting at.
And we're dealing with this. The other thing, okay, you're director of worldbeyondwar.org. The other thing that's going on is we're seeing we only got a couple minutes left, but we're seeing, it seems to be a concerted effort with big tech to suppress alternative media online, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Twitter, whether it's, various websites, Google, have you been experiencing any of that, or have you had a discussion with any other people in alternative media about that issue, YouTube, et cetera?
Yes, indeed. And I've had people who've studied it on my radio show just recently, talknationradio.org, if you want to go listen. And it seems that all the evidence thus far is that it's leftist publications that are being denied, links from Google and Facebook and so forth, whereas the rhetoric of the criticism is we're going to exclude those too far left and too far right, as if, it's whatever is politically centrist at the time is more accurate, more credible. And of course, none of the Google, Facebook, Twitter, none of these places have anybody with the expertise to actually determine what's accurate and what's inaccurate and what's been established and what hasn't.
Well, I got to say they are blocking quite a bit on the right. I know the YouTube thing personally, but I've talked to people. It's people on the left and the right, in fact, who are getting knocked out. But I've had it, and when you see Twitter banning people like Roger Stone or Milo or stuff like that, there's plenty of instances, and the search engine stuff. It is happening on the right as well.
Yeah, but that's for particular threats and nastiness from those individuals that don't measure up to Trump's, and he's not blocked. I don't know, maybe. And
there wasn't even a threat. There was no threat against, Milo made no threat whatsoever. It was people, period.
Well, even today, I don't know if you know today, Google and Twitter are being marched before Congress. And one of the things that Lee and I discuss a lot, and there is the belief that, there's certainly we're certainly moving into, because of the size of these Goliaths, into the antitrust realm, and that Congress has an implied threat of antitrust acts against these people if they don't buy into the program and do what they're told.
Well, I wish it did. I hope it does. I would be very pleasantly, but very surprised if Congress were to pursue busting up these monopolies. But it absolutely should.
Well, I don't think they will. I think that's just I think the implied threat is there to get them to do what they want. But thanks a lot. Once again, it's David Swanson, director of WorldBeyondWar.org, author, activist, radio host, and a multiple Nobel Peace Prize nominee. Thanks a lot, Dave. We'd love to have you back again sometimes.
Thank you.
All right. Well, boy, this has been another great show, Lee.
I got to say, though, one of the things is, and I just to end on this note, I think the partisanship, this is what I'm seeing. The partisanship is what allows us, people need to really wake up on both the left and right and realize that they're not the only ones being victimized. You know what I'm saying, yep. Garland? I think people really need to wake up on that on both sides. Anyway, we will be back tomorrow. Let's say hi to Joyanne Reed. We'll be back tomorrow on 105.5 FM. You're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.